Good evening, everyone. This is the 57th episode of the weekly show that we do on the Game Tech Reviews channel. So if you're joining us for the first time, we do these shows every Thursday evenings, North America time. So I try to make it interactive. So if you guys are new to the channel and you have questions about building a PC, or you're doing something with your PC, like you're upgrading or something, and you have a question, I may be able to answer the question live. Or if I'm not able to answer it due to answering someone else's question, somebody in the chat might be able to help you guys out. So with that being said, similar to last week, there's not a whole lot of new interesting news. We do have a few things to talk about regarding Zen 5 support on the current generation AM5 motherboards. So it looks like this week, the other brands, Gigabyte, Gigabyte, ASRock, and BioStar now all have released BIOS updates to add the new upcoming Zen 5 CPUs to their existing motherboards. So that's good to see. That further proves the point that I've been making a couple of weeks back, even months now, that I've been saying that Zen 5 is coming out in the summer, Q3. That's pretty much, it looks more and more like that's the case, just because we're seeing more and more news, not just leaks, more stuff like this. Like when an official motherboard gets support for the upcoming next generation CPUs, like the Gigabyte boards, for example. I just checked here. You guys can see the X670E Aorus Master has a new BIOS F24C, which updates AMD Agisa 1170 for next-gen Ryzen processor support. So that is Zen 5. So that means that if you want to do a drop-in socket upgrade, all you have to do is update to this BIOS minimum, and then you're good to go. It's good to see this happening earlier rather than later, because this allows the motherboard manufacturers to ship out their existing motherboards, mostly X670, B650, with support for Zen 5 day one. So that's one of the things. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit more later. The one huge thing in the news recently, and I have a video on how to mitigate this issue, is they call it gaming stability for the Intel CPUs. So this mostly applies to the i9 13900K and the 14900K and the 14900KS and maybe the 13900KS. The i9s are the ones that have the problem. We're going to look at the i7s here in a little bit, but I got a lot of comments on the video that I made. People asking for help, asking if the steps work. Like, are they going to ruin something if they go in the BIOS? Most of the questions I got, I could tell, are coming from people that are not familiar with going into the BIOS and changing these settings. They don't feel comfortable doing it. Waiting on Intel isn't really going to do anything, because regardless, it's going to require an update to the BIOS. So the manufacturers like MSI are now starting to offer BIOS updates that have toggles. What they really should do to make it bulletproof, so that a user doesn't have to go into the BIOS and do anything besides updating the BIOS, is they need to make the BIOS update set the default to Intel's official spec numbers, not expect the user to go in and change the values. Now, I made a video that I posted, I think it was on last Friday, so it's almost a week old now, but I made a video last Friday that shows you how to make these changes if you want to do this regardless of the BIOS updates, because the settings have always been adjustable since the 13th gen launched, and I don't know about 12th gen, but the same rules apply. And the thing is, they're trying to make it easier, but I don't really agree with some of the stuff that they're putting in these BIOSes, because these presets, like, for example, MSI has released one that they call boxed cooler. Boxed cooler, what does that mean? Does that mean Intel stock cooler? Does that mean, like, what does this mean? You know what I mean? It's saying the power limit will go to 253 watts. The problem with this statement, the problem with doing this, is the boxed cooler, they say boxed cooler, PL1, 253 watts. Now, a boxed cooler that can handle 253 watts is a Noctua NHD15. So this is such a vague description, because box cooler doesn't mean Intel stock cooler. Intel stock coolers can't handle 253 watts, like I said in my video. I even showed a Intel stock cooler in that video, telling people don't use that. If even with the power limits, it's not going to help. I mean, it's not going to be enough. So you're still going to overheat. So this is the thing. Like, I don't really agree with the presets that they're adding to the BIOS, because this isn't really, like, the water cooler 4096 watts. A water cooler is not going to handle 4096 watts. So that is ridiculous. I wish they would just straight up get rid of that setting. I mean, that's basically an LN2 overclockers preset. So it's like, I don't know who's going to set PL1 to 4096. That's kind of a silly number as far as I'm concerned. Hey, Gershon. Hey, RK. What's going on? Good evening. So you guys just tuned in for the more interesting topic, I guess, or I guess the most controversial one, the Intel power limit issue causing instability problems. This mostly is happening to 14th gen from what I understand. That doesn't mean that it can't happen to 13th gen though. And the reality is the 13th generation CPUs have been on the market for about a year and a half now. They're a year and a half old. So those are the ones that, if they've been running in that 4096 watt power mode, that could be cause for concern for longevity. So I myself have shown how to do this with the 13900K in a video that I released. So if you guys don't want to wait on a BIOS update, or you don't trust this BIOS update, because I honestly, this is not, I mean, this will kind of help, but this is not correct. I just want to point that out. This PL1 253 watts is not Intel spec. So even though they're doing this, this is still not good enough. I just want to point that out. So it'll work for the majority of people. The way I look at this, the first one, box cooler, that basically means Noctua NHD 15 and the 280 millimeter and the 240 millimeter good radiators, not the cheap ones that are worse than the D15 and the Deepcool AK620. Those are all covered under box cooler, according to this. Then they say tower air cooler, PL1 288. That is complete nonsense. The tower air cooler, this one, the 288 watt, that one is the water cooler one. That's the water cooler one. The water cooler one, this one down here, is the old one, which no one should be using that one. Like, that's the one that runs your ICC max at like 400 amps or more, or it's some stupid number of current amps, and that's probably what's degrading the CPU. So, I mean, I've gotten so many messages throughout the week on my video, people asking about, like, how can they tell if their CPU is degraded? And then people have tried to lower the power limit, and they have still been crashes reported. So it's just kind of a huge mess, and I can't fix those problems. If you set it to stock default and you're still having stability problems, the problem is probably elsewhere. It could be the CPU is just defective at that point, but you also need to rule out your RAM overclocks, assuming you're running XMP, because XMP is a RAM overclock. Let me re-emphasize that, or let me repeat that. Turning on XMP is overclocking your RAM. So, unless it's like some JEDEC number like 5600. So just keep that in mind. Even if you don't manually type in any numbers, just by turning on XMP, you're overclocking the RAM. And that's not guaranteed to be stable. So that's another area that needs to be looked at. And the problem is people are probably modifying, they'll probably read something online talking about VCCSA. They go and they put like 1.25 VCCSA. They're overvolting their memory controller. Maybe that part is degraded. Maybe that's why they're having stability problems, because stability problems are typically related to memory or CPU overclocking, as far as I'm concerned. Especially if it's in apps, not just games. So, because I've been hearing people tell me that their applications are crashing, and that to me throws up some red flags about RAM stability. So, how to cool your George Foreman grill? Yeah, the 4096 watts. Set a 14900K to PL1. That's how to generate enough heat to do a barbecue. There's also another thing right here. MSI's BIOS says CPU light load control, Intel default. This has to do with the amps. This is going to affect the amps. That just means unlimited box coolers, what would come with some Intel CPUs. If you have one of those set, it will override your manual for Intel specs. So if you turn this on, it overrides manual. I think it's the other way around. I think if you turn this on and then you manually type numbers in, the manual inputs override this, because this is like a blanket preset and it applies values, but as soon as you start changing individual values, it's going to override whatever's coming from the preset. CPUs just don't have enough voltage to be stable. Well, the problem is, I think the problem is not so much the voltage. I think the problem is actually the current draw is what's damaging the CPUs. Remember, guys, it's not really the voltage. It's all about the current. The current being pushed through the transistors is what's going to wear down the transistor gate, the drain. You know, the part of the MOSFET that degrades is due to the current flow through the device. It's the electron migration that starts happening which degrades the CPU, not the voltage. You know, it's like I replied to somebody because they were thinking that it's like excessive voltage. I told them, or there was another comment in my video mentioning that I should also mention ICC max. ICC max is still tied to the current draw and the voltage, because remember, when I apply a power limit, that is automatically going to reduce the current draw, because the voltage has an operating range. And the operating range of the voltage doesn't really vary that much relative to the amount of current that the CPU pulls. So your typical, 1.2 volts on V-core, your 1.16 or whatever on load, that, or your 1.038, whatever, your low load is like less than 1 volt. Those voltages, that range, doesn't change too much. What actually changes is the current draw. The current draw in amps is what changes with big swings based off of the power limit. That is the reason why in my video I focused on the power limit, because if you limit the CPU, which MSI is allowing users to do with this new preset, to 253 watts, if your voltage is still that same range, but now you cannot pull more than 253 watts, what is the number that actually goes down? The current. The current is what goes down when you power limit, more so than the voltage. The voltage might go down a little bit, but it's actually the current, which is reduced significantly when you run the CPU at the stock specs. And the reason why I don't agree with MSI's box cooler PL1 equal to 253 is because PL1 at 253 is not Intel spec. PL2 is supposed to be 253, not PL1. PL1 is the long duration power limit. That is the extended duration. So if we go to, let's look at the 14900K's product page on Intel's website. So if you scroll down right here, now they have changed their documentation. Back when the 13900K came out, where it says processor base power, it didn't say processor based power. It said PL1, power limit 1. They renamed PL1 recently, I don't know why, to processor base power. I mean, I guess it makes sense. So PL1 is the time averaged power dissipation that the processor is validated to not exceed during manufacturing while executing an Intel specified high complexity workload at base frequency and at the junction temperature as specified in the datasheet for the SKU segment and configuration. This means the long duration, which means this is the amount of power that it's supposed to use if it's trying to complete a task that takes an extended period of time. What's an example of that? Cinebench. Running Cinebench multi-thread is going to result in the processor base power being used. So if you set that to 253 watts, that means it's going to pull 253 watts maximum for a Cinebench run. Because it's talking about a high complexity workload at base frequency and at the junction temperature, which is I think 100 Celsius or whatever. So that is PL1, and that is officially 125 watts. That is where they get their advertised TDP of 125 watts. Now, it's laughable to say that the 14900K is a 125 watt CPU because, as we know, the CPU, the motherboard BIOS, like a Z790 BIOS that the CPU is installed into, runs at the 4096 watt limit, which basically means that it doesn't run at 125 watts. It will far exceed that. I've shown that in the video. It'll pull close to 300 watts is where it'll pull. So obviously it's not going to pull 4096 watts because it can't physically do that. It just can't pull that much current to equal that amount of power. So what ends up happening is it basically runs at the limit of the transistor's capability to pull current. And that turns out to be, it ends up equaling, if you do the math, the voltage times the current equals about 300 watts. That's where it tops out. Now you can make it use more if you overclock, but if you raise voltages. And that's what I suspect some people might be doing that, and they might be running into these stability problems. Now, the maximum turbo power, this one used to be called PL2. This is the short duration. This is your boost. This is like the quick thing. It's like if I need to open calculator real quick to do some math, like by opening up calculator in Windows, it'll turbo up, it'll spike up fast. It'll raise the frequency on maybe 1 or 2 threads to maximum frequency, which in this case would be 5.8 gigahertz, or I guess technically 6 gigahertz on maybe like 1 core. And it'll do that quickly, and it will spike to 253 watts instantaneously in that small moment of time to be able to do that task very quickly. That is how Intel achieves its single thread performance, based off of the PL2. The PL2 affects single thread. The PL1 affects multi-thread. So you can see that the official spec says 125 watt for multi-thread and 253 watt single thread. That's what these numbers mean. And if we read the definition of the single thread maximum turbo, the maximum sustained, meaning greater than 1 second, power dissipation of the processor as limited by, notice here, notice the limiting factor, current and or temperature, not voltage. I want to stress this point. It's not about the voltage. It's about the current and the temperature. Those are the things that control or what determine the boost algorithm on these Intel CPUs. Instantaneous power may exceed the maximum turbo power, aka PL2, for short durations, less than or equal to 10 milliseconds. This is what I meant when I said you open up calculator real quick. When you open up the app, the quick spike to 253 watts to get that task done as soon as possible on a few threads. That is what this is. So, the thing that I don't agree with is all these fixes, quote-unquote fixes, are telling the BIOS to set PL1, aka the multi-thread, to 253 watts. So that is incorrect. I just want to stress this point. That is not Intel spec, because Intel spec is 125. So if you want to run your CPU at the official Intel specs, you cannot rely, unfortunately, you cannot rely on these BIOS presets. You have to actually manually go in and set it yourself, as I showed in that video. That's the only way, that's the only bulletproof way to fix the problem or avoid the stability problem and not overdraw on the current and prematurely shorten the lifespan of your expensive i9 CPU. So, that being said, I have actually ran my 3900K pretty much stock the entire time that I've had it, just so you guys know. So I have not experienced this problem that people have been talking about at all, but I knew what was causing the problem, so I made the video, and I basically just showed people how to set it up so they can run it the way I run it, and I've never had any of these problems. So I'm not surprised that this is happening. Like I said in the video, the only downside of doing this, of letting it run at the stock configuration, is you do lose a lot of performance. You lose about 7 to 10% on your boost for single or lightly threaded workloads, and you lose about 15 to 16% performance in your multi-thread workloads. But you do reduce the power consumption significantly to the point where any decent air cooler, like a Noctua air cooler or a Deepcool air cooler or a Thermalright, all those big fat air coolers, they can magically handle an Intel CPU just like an AMD CPU now if you run it at the Intel stock. So I personally limited mine day one because I was using a Noctua air cooler on it. And I'm not going to run a liquid cooler on the Intel CPU. I don't care what people say. I'm going to run an air cooler because I want to run an air cooler. And if I have to power limit my CPU to do that, so be it. Yes, it becomes slower than my AMD computer, hence the reason why I don't use the Intel computer as my main computer. It ends up becoming like a home NAS machine or like a dedicated home server. That's basically how the i9 is living its entire lifespan. Meanwhile, AMD becomes the gaming PC and the streaming PC. But that's just how it is. So, and I'm one data point in the grand scheme of things, but that's basically how I do it. Hey, Leo Gaming, you went from a 5800X to a 7800X 3D. You notice the 7800X3 runs at a lower voltage. Yeah, that's because it's on a smaller node, so it doesn't use as much voltage. Yeah, in general, it's a little bit less. It's not that much less, though. But yeah, X3D doesn't use a lot of power. None of the X3Ds use a lot of power. In fact, this one, so I've got one right here. The Ryzen 9, the 7950X 3D. This one pulls about 125 watts to 130 watts. I mean, that's basically what it does. The non-X3D, so this one over here, the one that all the crypto people are looking for, this one pulls about 170 watts under full load. Now, this one can pull quite a bit. This one, the short duration, similar to Intel, this one, Intel does like 253. This one does about 230 maximum. So it's still like 23 watts less under full load, but it does use significantly more power under the turbo load. Now, there are a lot of things to do with tweaking the AMD CPUs without losing a lot of performance. Like, for example, there's the curve optimizer. You can undervolt on Intel. The problem with undervolting on Intel, and I feel like this might be another reason why people are running into stability problems. Undervolting on Intel is not a good recommended fix. I don't recommend undervolting on Intel because Intel doesn't do overclocking / underclocking in the same way that Ryzen does. So I guess now we can dive into this with paint to try to illustrate this better for people. So in the overclocking world, you have CPUs, and you have GPUs. And I guess you have RAM, but that's kind of separate, so we're not going to talk about that right now. Although we're probably going to talk about RAM later, because I've been doing a lot of stuff with high-speed memory recently. So that'll probably be one of the topics toward the end of the stream. So you have CPUs, and you have GPUs. GPUs, you have Radeon, you have GeForce, you have basically, you know, Team Red, Team Green GPUs. And then CPUs, you have Intel, obviously. And okay, technically you have Intel in the GPU world also now. But we're just going to simplify it. So you have Intel, and then you also have the AMD Ryzen. Now, the thing with Ryzen actually doesn't overclock like a CPU. Yes, it does in the sense that you have the same parameters. Like you have your all-core turbo multiplier. You have your memory divider and all that stuff. You don't do things like that with the GPU overclocking. But Ryzen overclocking, actually, it's more like a hybrid. The way you overclock Ryzen is kind of like overclocking a GPU in the sense that you're playing around with a voltage frequency curve that basically gives you the ability to... So if I say, for example, let's say we have a voltage frequency curve. So at a given voltage, I have a given frequency. And the curve typically looks something like if I want to run at a higher frequency, my voltage has to go up. So at a certain point, it becomes like really, really hard. It'll need like way copious amounts of voltage where it's not realistic. So just to put some numbers here, we'll say this is 5 gigahertz. We'll say this is in gigahertz. The units are in gigahertz for the frequency. And then the voltage, we'll just say, are in millivolts or whatever. It doesn't have to be millivolts. Just to put some units so people understand what we're talking about. So if this is 5 gigahertz, at the 5 gigahertz point, at this point on the graph, I have a certain voltage associated with that frequency. When if I want to run the CPU higher than 5 gigahertz, let's say I want to run it at 5.5 gigahertz. At 5.5 gigahertz, you can see now that's higher up on this curve. So that means the amount of voltage required to run the CPU at 5.5 is higher than 5 gigahertz. So if we say this is V2, this is V1, this is, well, this is just, we'll just use these numbers, but this is like F1 and F2. You guys can see the relation here between the voltage and the frequency. So this is what they mean when they talk about the voltage frequency curve. And when you use things like PBO and curve optimizer is basically creating another curve, like a more, we'll just use yellow here, like it's trying to adjust the curve either down, it's either trying to make the curve shift this way or go shift up this way, if that makes sense. So the blue line, this blue line indicates positive curve offset. So when you go into the BIOS and you set a positive curve offset, you're creating this blue line. You're shifting the curve such that now, if you want to run at the same frequency, you now need a even higher voltage than you had before. So you can see positive curve offset is typically not used with modern Zen 4, aka Ryzen 7000 CPUs, because it's going to increase the voltage, and it's going to, as a result, increase the power consumption, and as a result of that, the temperatures will go up, which means you'll hit your thermal limit faster than you would have at stock. This is the reason why when we talk about overclocking on Ryzen, it's usually a negative. I think that's the wrong shade of yellow. I guess it was the brighter one. Negative offset is what people typically use, because at if you apply a negative offset, as you guys can see on the graph, you can deduce that now with the yellow curve, now at 5 gigahertz, my voltage is lower than it was originally. And likewise, the higher frequency is also running at a lower voltage. So negative offset reduces voltage, or it reduces voltage for a given frequency. That means at 5.5 gigahertz on a negative offset, I now use less voltage than V2, which was what I used to run the voltage at for 5.5 at the stock voltage. So that is how you typically optimize on a Ryzen CPU, by adjusting the position of that voltage frequency curve. Now with Intel CPUs, you don't really have this concept, or the concept it does apply, but unfortunately you can't really do things in the BIOS directly to influence the boost algorithm to function this way, because ultimately what's actually creating that new curve is the adjustment made to the offset, which basically shifts the behavior of that boost frequency, that boost algorithm on the Ryzen CPU. Now, Intel CPUs, they don't have that. Intel, the closest equivalent Intel has to that is something called adaptive voltage, which is something that has existed since the Intel Haswell CPUs. So that's the fourth gen Intel CPUs from 2013. So that's pretty old, but that's typically what they use to try to mimic or get as close to this sort of curve optimization behavior. So the reason why I don't like recommending undervolting on Intel is because the boot, like if you lower the voltage, you just straight up set you lower the voltage by, let's say you do 0.05, negative 0.1 or negative 0.05 on as a negative offset for Intel. Now, the problem with that is now you're trying to force the CPU to always use 0.5 or whatever your offset was less, assuming it's a negative number, a negative offset, than what it is trying to use by default, which means you're trying to force the CPU to maintain the same frequencies, kind of like what AMD is doing. But the problem is the CPU is not designed to kind of have that intelligence built in. It's not trying to adjust the entire boost algorithm. It's just kind of forced to do that as an after effect of reducing the voltage. So what could potentially happen is you run into instability when you undervolt the Intel CPUs. And that's the reason why I don't typically recommend undervolting Intel CPUs for that very reason, because it's much harder to troubleshoot if something goes wrong. With AMD, unless you're applying like a really, really negative offset, like you're doing like negative 50 or negative 45 or even negative 40, you could end up introducing instability for the exact same reasons you would get instability when you undervolt an Intel CPU. So that's just something to keep in mind. And that's why Ryzen CPUs, I've always thought of them as kind of like this hybrid when it comes to overclocking them. You're basically, the name of the game is you try to get more for less. You try to get more boost with less voltage and the reason why this works on Ryzen, it doesn't really work as well on Intel, is because Ryzen's boost algorithm is tied to the operating temperature, whereas Intel's boost algorithm is literally just tied to the power limit. So, both of them they're still confined to temperature. Like Intel's still confined to temperature as well. That's not the primary limit. That's not the first thing that is going to limit Intel's boost algorithm. It's typically going to be the power limit. And that's the reason why you see this issue with motherboard manufacturers setting 4096 watts on the Intel BIOS, and that's why they're burning themselves up. Or they're not burning themselves up literally, they're just kind of slowly killing themselves off with degradation due to electron migration happening at the molecular level. So, whereas with Ryzen's not power limited as the primary limiting factor, it's actually the temperature. The temperature is what it's targeting. It targets to a temperature and it will boost and boost and boost until it gets to that temperature, then it will level off. And it doesn't consider that thermal throttling. If it thermal throttles, that means that it has to reduce the operating temperature, or it has to reduce the frequency that's running at well below the boost range, the extended frequency range. So that's how you know if you're thermal throttling on a Ryzen CPU versus an Intel CPU. Well, an Intel CPU basically goes to 100 degrees and then it thermal throttles. The AMD CPU depends on the SKU, but some of them they're going to try to turbo all the way up to like 89, and then they're going to level off the current, and they'll basically shift into more of like a PL1 operating power limit, which I think is like 170 watts for the non-X3D and 120 watts for the X3D. So, yeah, they behave similar, but they're bound by different constraints as in terms of their priorities. So, I guess to make this easy for people to understand, Intel CPUs are primarily constrained by power limits. This is the primary. Now, I don't want people to misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that they're not constrained by thermals, because they are. I'm talking about the first condition that they're looking for to determine how they limit the boost behavior. And for Intel CPUs, it's the power limit. Hence the reason why the whole fiasco with 4096 watts and unlimited power mode. So Ryzen CPUs are primarily constrained by thermal limit. That is, they basically boost to a specific target temperature and then they level off. That's how they work. The Intel ones, they boost, especially if they're on limited power, until they end up behaving very much like the Ryzen CPUs. They hit a thermal limit at a certain point. Even with high-end cooling, they're still going to probably hit a thermal limit. Otherwise, they're going to hit 300-something watts, and that's going to be the end for them. They're just going to go up there to like 300-something watts, 350 watts, and they're going to stop because they literally can't pull more current through those transistors. So even though it says 4096, they're going to run to whatever the physical limits of their transistors are, which I think the full thing is like 350 something or whatever. So 380 watts. So wasn't there that one thing about the 14900KS? That one could pull like 500 watts or some ridiculous number. I don't even want to think what the reliability, the lifespan of that CPU is. If someone's actually running it with that 500 watt TDP configuration. Like that's, I don't know. Ryzen has 3 limiters, temp, clock speed, and power. Well, all of them have clock and power and temperature. What I'm talking about is the primary limit, the first one on the list. So if we want to do this in terms of prioritization, first, thermal. Second, well, I guess we'll just do it like this. Well, no, first, second. First, the second one, power. The third one, clock speed. This is the order in which it limits itself. The order is different, is what I'm trying to convey. First, power. Second, thermal. Third, as far as I know, clock speed, although I'm not 100% sure on that one. I haven't done that much overclocking with Intel, with modern Intel CPUs, to really understand if this is their third one over thermal. I might have these two backwards on Intel, but I know this is the prioritization for AMD. AMD's first limited by thermal, second limited by power, third limited by clock speed. Because as you guys know, if you're anyone who has done any extreme overclocking with AMD, and I know RK, if RK is listening, he knows exactly what I'm talking about. For every 10 degrees that you can drop the temperature on the AMD Ryzen, you gain on average, about 100 megahertz on your boost clock. That tells me that thermal is the primary limit, because if you have insanely good cooling, or if you delid the Ryzen CPU to the point where it cannot hit its thermal target, which in this case is either 89 or 95 degrees, depending on the Ryzen CPU. If it can no longer physically reach its target temperature, meaning number one is literally removed from the list, now your second limiter is what holds it back. And that's going to be the power limit. The physical power limit. The ability to pull the current through the transistors. That is what's going to limit it after thermals, not clock speed. Because we know that Ryzen can continue to raise the clock speed and continue to be stable as long as it is not reaching its thermal target. We know this because Steve from Gamers Nexus had invited the AMD guys. He had AMD engineers. If you guys remember the Ryzen launch, those guys are doing extreme LN2. They were doing liquid nitrogen overclocking on the Ryzen 79. They did the 7600X, and I think the 7950X, or maybe the 7900X. Anyway, they had some Ryzen CPUs. They were doing LN2 overclocking. And I remember because they were under sub-zero temperature, It was impossible. It was physically impossible for the Ryzen CPU to reach 95C. It was trying its best to get to 95C, but it could not do it because the LN2 was so overwhelmingly cold that it could never reach its target temperature. So what did it do? It kept raising the clock speed. It kept going up. 6 gigahertz, 6.2 gigahertz, 6.5 gigahertz. It just kept going up until it reached the limit of what the actual transistors can pull in terms of power. That is why we know for a fact that Ryzen is limited in this order. Now for Intel, it's different. Intel, it's definitely power is number one as the first limiting factor in terms of the boost algorithm. But these two, I'm not 100% sure. I don't know what the upper stable limit for Intel's clock speeds are. So, and I don't know if the clock speed, if the physical transistors can only run up to a certain frequency and they just cannot go beyond that frequency, or if it's limited by thermal. My guess is it's probably thermal limited before it's clock speed limited, just like AMD. So that's the difference. And that's the reason why Intel's having this fiasco in the news with stability, because of the BIOS manufacturers altering the first gate in terms of what controls the CPU's boost algorithm. And that's why there's stability problems on Intel. That's why you don't see that problem on Ryzen, because they're fundamentally gated or limited by different things. Okay, are there any questions, any comments, any observations from the viewers? Otherwise, this is probably going to be the end for this specific topic, but I think this is a pretty interesting one. All right, so now let's move on to, let's talk about the BIOS updates for the AMD motherboards. Monolithic Ryzen should be the same as what, Ryzen? I assume it's going to behave just like Ryzen. It's that same priority. Thermal first, power second, clock speed third. Especially for mobile. Mobile CPUs are going to be the same. Yes, it's gonna, all the Ryzen CPUs I think behave the same. They weren't always that way. So if you guys remember, Zen 1 was, oh, actually that's a good let's bring that up real quick. So if you guys remember, Zen 1, so the first generation of Ryzen, the first limit was clock speed. Zen 1, aka the 1800X, the Ryzen 5 1600X, all those old CPUs from 2017, those were limited by clock speed first. Then they were limited by thermal, and then they were limited by power. They were not limited by power initially, because if you guys remember, the initial Ryzen CPUs, they could get up to like 4. All-core, you could do like 3.9, and if you were really, really lucky, you could do 4 gigahertz. If you especially knew how to use load line calibration, you could get 4 gigahertz all-core on a really good bin of an 1800X. But in general, you were clock speed limited. You weren't going to be running an 1800X at like 5 gigahertz. That was not going to happen. The only way that could happen was by completely eliminating these entirely, meaning LN2 and max power, raise voltage as much as possible at under sub-zero, so you could get the clock speed to get up to like 5 gigahertz. But that was the only way to do that. So obviously you were limited by the clock speed. So you can see it's not like it's always been the same. The priority list for thermal or for boost algorithms change with each generation. In fact, if I analyze Zen 2 and Zen 3 both I would say the first limiter on them is probably power. They're like Intel. They're power limited first, and then they're thermal limited, and then they're clock speed limited. Yeah, I'm pretty sure this is, yeah. So you guys can see Zen 2 and 3, they did not try to boost to 90 degrees. That's not how they worked. So they behave a lot like Intel's current CPUs. They were power limited first because the limiting factor on AM4 as Zen got better and better was the physical socket. The physical socket only allowed, I think the total power draw was like 130 watts or 140 watts through the socket. And obviously you're power limited at that rate. And that's the reason why the Ryzen 5000, the Zen 3 CPUs, which were excellent CPUs for the time, they were the best of the best. Those CPUs, they were very they came across as extremely energy efficient and high performing. And they were 100% power limited. Those things were so power limited. That's the reason why they appeared so efficient. Because if you could blast power on a 5800X the way you can on a 13700K, man, you could probably hit like 5.5 gigahertz on that old Zen 3 CPU. Now, having said that, I don't know, like these two might be flipped around. Like maybe clock speed and then thermal will be last. I can see it going this way. But the only way you really know the correct order is you have to analyze how the CPUs behave under extreme conditions. So when they're being thermal throttled, what happens when they have inadequate cooling? What happens when they have extreme exotic cooling? What happens when they're under LN2? That is how you figure out what the priority list is. So the more I think about it, the clock speed might be more of the physical limit versus thermal, because I've never heard of a Zen 3 or a Zen 2 CPU having thermal problems unless it was a bad mount or it was inadequately cooled. So they're definitely power limited first, and then maybe clock speed. But TSMC's node on Zen 3 was really good. So I don't know. It's a tough call. I'd have to look at how they behave under LN2 to figure out what's second and third for their actual limiters. But they change. You can see the point is that they change. The priorities change. So who knows? Zen 5 might change things around again. Maybe AMD like changes the IHS design as an example, and they're no longer thermally constrained through the IHS because they revise the design. Who knows? We don't know. But it'll be interesting to see if Zen 5 changes this up again. Okay. Speaking of Zen 5, Gigabyte motherboards now have a GISA 1170. Now, if I remember correctly, in the ASUS article from earlier this month, the change log, yes, 1170 introduces a change that adds Granite Ridge support, which is basically Zen 5. But it also changes something for Raphael. So Raphael gets some change with this new BIOS, which means I need to update my BIOS and see if I can run 96 gigs at 8,000 now. Because I've been testing RAM in my free time. I've been working on a video, for those wondering, on 8,000 megatransfers DDR5. And as you guys know, if you guys saw my video from Monday, I show that literally if you want to run 8,000 megatransfers on 48 gigabytes, basically 2x24, and you want to run that on Ryzen, it's super easy. It's brain dead easy. You buy the 8,000 kit, you install it in the system, you go into the BIOS, you literally just turn on the XMP profile, and you go to Windows, and that's it. I mean, test the stability of the system. But that's it. That's all you got to do. It's super easy, and you only need 1.2 volt SoC, and it just straight up works. Like, it's super smooth. So the next challenge I've been working on, and I'm having a hard time with this one, is how to run 4 sticks of memory, 4 DIMMs, 96 gigabytes at 8,000 on Ryzen, and that turned out to be a much bigger challenge than I ever imagined. So far, what I can tell you guys, without spoiling too much of the video, I can get it to post, but I cannot get it to be stable. So I can get into the BIOS at 8,000 on 4 DIMMs, on 4 DIMMs. That's 4 times 24. And it'll go to the BIOS every now and then, but then it will not be stable. Like, it's not stable. So, and I've been messing with impedance values, because that's what allowed me to get 192 gigabytes to work at 6,000. And what I can tell you is, well, I don't want to ruin the video. I want you guys to watch the video. So that's all I'll say for now. But I am going to test this new BIOS. So it's good to see ASRock also has the BIOS update for Zen 5. So I'm definitely going to update my ASRock BIOS to this latest one, and then see if I can get that 8,000 to work again with 4 sticks, and do some further stability testing and see what my conclusion is there. So stay tuned for that. That's been a real, it's like a really interesting challenge trying to do 4 sticks of memory. 4 sticks of memory is what I consider hard mode. 2 sticks of memory is easy mode. Because you can do 96 across 2 sticks, and that's probably what I'd recommend, but you've got some options for the 4 sticks. You're not stuck at like 3,600, which a lot of people seem to think for whatever reason. But yeah, you can run decent speeds on 4 DIMMs now. And I'm talking like higher density. I'm not talking about 64 gigabytes. 64 gigabytes, that's easy on 4 sticks. I'm talking about higher capacity with 4 sticks. Do you use ASRock motherboards on Intel? No. I have never used an ASRock motherboard on Intel. So I have a couple of motherboards to test. So I have the Gigabyte for AMD. I'll probably upgrade that one, but I'm not really doing anything with the Gigabyte board specifically for Ryzen right now. But stay tuned, because I might actually look into that, because I might test the CPU mining king right now, the best CPU for mining crypto, the 7950X. This is with the Gigabyte Aorus Master, so I may test this with the 4 sticks of memory. Although I prefer not to take that computer apart and mess with it, because this one with the Aorus Master is what I use to live stream with. So, like, for example, you guys see me live right now. This computer is running off of a 7950X with the Gigabyte Aorus Master. So the X670E, which is basically the one right here. And it does have Zen 5 support now. So definitely I do need to update. At the very least, I need to update so it has a Zen 5 support ready to go. But at this point, I don't know if I'm limited by the IMC on the 7950X 3D, or if it's the ASRock motherboard, or what, or if it's the DIMMs themselves not getting along. Because, and this might be a good talking point, is the memory sticks. If you're going to run 4 sticks of memory, you need to know how to install them. Oh wow, they even have the help bot on the Intel side. I can help with your Intel processor issues. So it's like Intel's very well aware of their Intel CPU issues right now. So this is from Intel's website. So this is DDR5/DDR4 memory module installation on Intel 600 series supporting 12th gen. So this is an old article that they posted, mainly to teach people how to deal with DDR5 mostly, because they probably were afraid that people are going to try 4 sticks and run into all kinds of problems. So this applies to both Intel and AMD. This is just how to install memory in general. So we're going to go over this because I think a lot of people don't know how to do it correctly. So let's say I have one let's say I get 1 kit of RAM. I got 2 sticks of memory. So that means this picture down here, the bottom right. So I've got channel 1 and channel 2. Or let's say channel A and channel B. So you're going to put 1 stick of memory in the A channel, and you got the second stick in the B channel. And it all works. You know, they say put one in A2 and the other one B2. What they show here in the bottom right is literally A2 and B2. They call it channel 0 and channel 1, and DIMM 0 and DIMM 0. But it's basically A2, B2, 1 stick, 2 stick. That's it. That is a 2-stick DDR4 or DDR5 configuration. And the processor is an Intel or a AMD CPU. It doesn't really matter what the processor is. The process is the same for both CPUs. Now, what happens if I like this memory so much, but I need more memory? So what do? I go and I buy another kit of memory. The exact same kit. Or maybe it's a different kit. But let's just say, to make things easy, in general, if you want to add 2 more sticks of memory, you want to make sure you buy the exact same kit. You don't want to buy 2 different brands, 2 different amounts. You don't want to buy, like for example, if I bought a G-Skill first, I want to buy the exact same G-Skill a second time. I don't want to go buy a Corsair. I don't want to go buy a Team Group or a T-Force or a Kingston or a Crucial. I don't want to buy like a different brand of RAM because I don't want to cause the likelihood of instability or incompatibility between the RAM sticks. So I buy the exact same kit a second time. So now I have 2 identical kits for a total of 4 sticks of memory. Now, how do I install the second kit? The first thing that people probably think to do is what's shown here in the bottom left. The bottom left. So they keep their first kit of memory in A2 and B2, but then they add the second kit to the empty slots. They basically just simply fill up the other 2 slots with their new kit of memory. That is wrong. That is completely incorrect. That is the wrong way to install memory. It's the same with DDR5. It's the same with DDR4. It is completely incorrect and it is wrong. And I'm going to explain why it's wrong. The reason why it's wrong is because when you put memory... Where's paint? Okay, I like this little diagram that I made, but oh well. We'll leave the curve optimizer up there, I guess. So when you have a motherboard, let's say I've got a motherboard. Let's say I've got the Aorus Master because it looks kind of square. So it's an EATX. And then I have a CPU socket here. So let's say we've got an AM5. Let's say we want to build a Zen 5 system this summer. So it's going to have the Ryzen 9000 series, the fastest CPU on the planet at the time. So now we want to put some RAM in here. So I'm going to label these. I'm going to color code these. So my first channel, channel A, we'll do red for channel A. Mismatch memory and unwillingness to do the correct thing, and then approach tech support to address the issue is exactly why I don't like troubleshooting systems. Yeah. That's job security for help desk, though. So the A channel is like this. The B channel will use blue. We got some Radeon colored RAM and we got some Intel Arc colored RAM. Or I guess the slots are like this. So you got 4 slots on the motherboard. Now, when you install, let's use yellow, I guess, for the DIMMs themselves. So if I want to install, okay, let's say I bought 2x 16 gigabyte, 6,000 mega transfers. Let's say I bought this RAM kit. Let's say I bought like a Corsair or some whatever. Like let's say Corsair Vengeance. The brand doesn't matter. Let's say I bought this RAM. Now, how do I install this? This is considered 1R, 1 DPC. For a dual channel, this implies dual channel. That's 2 sticks. 2 sticks, single rank, 1 DIMM per channel for dual channel. That means one of them needs to go in the red and the other one needs to go in the blue. Because I got in red, I've got channel A, I've got A, and in blue, I've got B. I got channel A and I've got channel B. I got A1, A2, and B1, B2. But if I want to take advantage of dual channel, you need one to be in red and one to be in blue. If you put both of them in red, if I fill up red, let's say I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to build a PC. I've never done it before. So I go watch The Verge's How to Build a PC video, and I just put the RAM in like this. Okay, I put them both in the first 2 slots because my intelligence tells me, my intuition tells me that the first 2 are closer to the CPU, therefore they're going to have lower latency and they're the best ones to use first. So I'm going to put them both in the 2 red ones. That means I'm going to end up running in single channel mode, which means I lose out on a lot of throughput because I can't take advantage of dual channel. So technically it'll work, it's just not ideal. It's not going to give you the best performance. So what you want to do is you want to put one of them in the red one and the other one in the blue one. That is how to do single rank, single DIMM per channel, or 1 DIMM per channel. That's what's listed here. Now, what happens if let's say I made a mistake, I go return that RAM, and let's say I buy 2x 32 gigabyte 6,000. This is considered, for now, it's considered. Now, I want to emphasize this point because in the future, this will change. We're talking about memory that's on the market today. So if you buy a 2x 32 gig kit, that's 64 gigs total. That is considered a 2R 1 DPC for dual channel. It's dual rank. That's what the 2R is. It means that it is dual ranks. And ranks I know on DDR5 are a little bit different. So it's kind of like a single rank is kind of like dual rank of DDR4, sort of. You can think of it that way. But I don't want to confuse the audience with those technical differences because I think that's just going to confuse people that are new. So we're just going to keep it like it's DDR4 in this regard. So think of it like dual rank, 1 DIMM per channel. So how would I install those? Well, the exact same way. 1 goes in A, 1 goes in B. It's still the same thing. That is what Intel describes on their website in this picture. That is the upper right. The upper right picture shows a 2 DPC. No, that's not right. With 1 slot unpopulated per channel. 2 DIMM. What are they talking about? With 1 slot. Oh, 1 slot populated per channel. Oh, I see what. Okay. I misunderstood this. Okay, now I get it. But 2 DPC. So when they're talking about DPC, they're actually referring to the physical motherboard. So the bottom right is describing a motherboard that only has 1 DIMM per channel for the motherboard. So think of this bottom right as like a Threadripper TRX 50 motherboard. Because the Threadripper, like when I did that Threadripper build last year, that Threadripper motherboard has 4 physical DIMM slots. but it has 4 memory channels. So each one of those slots has its own memory channel. So it had memory channel A, B, C, and D. It did not have A1, A2, B1, B2. It literally had A, B, C, D, which means you can literally just run 4 sticks of memory as fast as you want because that's considered one DPC. So you basically get the benefit of treating it like it's a 2-DIMM mainstream motherboard. So think of it another way. Think of it like the Apex from Asus. That's a 2-DIMM ITX or MATX motherboard. It's an overclocker's motherboard. Or the Gigabyte Tachyon. Those motherboards have 2 DIMM slots. And those are the best ones for memory overclocking because they only have 1 DIMM slot per channel. So they're basically what's described in this bottom right-hand picture here from Intel. So all the 2-DIMM overclocker boards and all the Threadripper boards, the TRX50 boards, I'm not talking about the workstation boards, I'm talking about the HEDT boards. All the Threadripper and the high-end 2-DIMM motherboards are the same. They all behave the same. They all fit the category on the lower right down here. That is the reason why Threadripper can run like 1 terabyte of memory. Okay, I don't know about 1 terabyte of memory because I don't know what DIMMs do that. But Threadripper, what I can tell you guys, Threadripper, I personally am running 128 gigs of memory on Threadripper at 6400, no problem, and it's super fast. And there's like no issues with like long post times or any of that stuff. And that's because it's literally like a 2-DIMM Ryzen or Intel motherboard, even though it has 4 sticks of memory. So keep that in mind. That's because it has 4 different channels. Now, you can't do that on a Ryzen or an Intel mainstream board because you don't have 4 memory channels. There's no quad channel. It's only dual channel. So that describes now the upper slot or the upper right hand corner here. So this upper right hand corner is what most people have. They have a 2 DPC motherboard, which means they have a 4 slot motherboard or 4 DIMM slot motherboard, and they're running either 2 or 4 sticks of memory. So the upper right hand corner is describing those who are running 2 sticks of memory. Like, for example, me. The system that I'm live streaming on right now is running 2 sticks of memory of DDR5 for a total of 96 gigabytes of RAM. I got 2x48 at 6400 megatransfers. So that's what I'm running personally. So I fall into the category in the upper right. But my Threadripper falls into the lower right category, even though it has 4 sticks of memory. So just keep in mind the differences. Now, here is where it gets complicated. 4 sticks of memory. What happens, because I get this question all the time, anytime I post a video on YouTube about memory, somebody always leaves a question asking about how to do 4, like, can I run 4 sticks? How do I do 4 sticks? It looks nicer. I like how it looks. I want all the RGB. You know, I don't like the 2 empty slots. So, and they're running DDR5, obviously, because if you were on DDR4, you wouldn't have this problem, or it wouldn't be challenging. So, when you buy the second kit of memory, you need to remove the first two DIMMs. So let's say we started with the upper right. So we had the first kit of memory, but now I bought the second kit of memory. I have to physically remove the 2 that were already installed, and I have to move them together so that they are bundled together on the same channel. You need them to be on the same channel. Why do I need them to be on the same channel? Because unless you buy a kit of memory that has 4 sticks in the box day one, like if you're buying 2 separate kits, even if it's the same brand, even if it's the exact same model, there are micro tolerance differences due to different batches. So unless they're literally from the exact same batch, they were manufactured at the factory on the exact same day, you know, same Hynix DRAM ICs, etc. The PCB from G-Skills is the same. Everything's the same unless they're exactly identical and made on the exact same day. Even though they're two physical different kits, you can't consider them the same. So you have to consider them mismatched. So because they're mismatched, you cannot mix them together, which means I cannot take one stick from this one and another stick from this one and put them on channel A together and expect everything to work hunky-dory, no problems. You know, like it might work, but there's a good chance it might not work. Or what's more likely to happen is it will work, but it will not clock as high, or it could not run at the best timings as it possibly could because it's mismatched. So when people buy, because this happens all the time, people will buy a second kit of memory, they'll install the memory in the empty slots, and they'll end up in the lower left-hand corner here, 2D PC with mixed DIMMs. That is what most people end up doing, believe it or not. Like, not knowing that that's wrong. They don't know that they're doing it wrong. So what you have to do is you have to physically uninstall the first two memory sticks, group them together, put them on either A channel or B channel, and then install the new kit of memory on the other channel. So for example, if I take my first two out, I put them in channel A together, now I'm going to put my new ones in B1 and B2, and that's where they're going to go. And that's exactly how I have my 8000 megatransfer RAM installed on my test computer right now. I have them set up in the exact way it's shown in the upper left. So the first kit that I made that video about 8000 megahertz, that's in channel A, and the second kit that I got recently, that's in channel B. And it works, it can post, it can get into the BIOS at 8000, it's not stable at 8000. I'm kind of trying different things with impedance, so we'll see if I can actually get it to work. But you can easily do like 6000 Gear 1 with 4 sticks. It's not hard. I mean, there's a couple of things you got to change manually for impedance. It's very much dependent on your motherboard more than anything else, is what I've found. I do plan to test it on another CPU and another motherboard just to make sure. But from what I understand, it's actually the motherboard that limits you more than anything else with these 4-stick memory setups. So that's the memory thing that I wanted to bring up, because I know a lot of people, either they forget this or they don't think about it and they have all kinds of weird stability problems. Or like what usually happens is someone goes and watches my video, how to do 192 gigabytes at 6000, and either they don't watch the full video, they either watch the very beginning and then they watch the very end, and then they try to do the very beginning part on their own, skipping the entire middle section, and then it's not stable, and then they leave a comment asking like, how can I help them fix it or help them figure out what to do. It's like, well, did you watch the full video? Did you make all the manual changes? And also, what motherboard are you using and what memory are you using? So that's why I wanted to clear this up, because I get these comments all the time, and it's people asking, they're genuinely asking for help, and I can't address these all on case-by-case basis. I have to do something like talk about it live like this, and then answer any questions that come up while I'm able to address the questions. So that's DDR5, 4 sticks. So same as DDR4 in terms of how you're supposed to install mismatched DIMMs. And with that, I think that's pretty much it. That's those things. Oh, I did manage to find the Intel. Where is it? Here it is. I did find this. I wanted to show this on the live stream last week, and I couldn't find the bookmark. This is the official spec, because someone put the power limits on their 14th gen CPU, and they're still having crashes, and they're messaging me about it, and I told them the other thing that you need to check is your RAM. Like, what's your RAM running at? If you've got XMP on, maybe you need to make a change to VCCSA or something, or have you tried LLC? adjustments, those sort of things, and they didn't know what I was talking about, although they did understand to check XMP. So, here are the official specs for Intel CPUs with DDR5. Maximum supported speed for 32 gigabytes or 48 gigabytes, 5600. Maximum supported speed for 64 gigabytes or 96 gigabytes on 2 sticks of memory total, 5200. So it's the same as AMD. So actually, it's the same as AMD. I didn't realize that until I saw this. And then here's where it gets really interesting. 2 DPC. So this is the 4 sticks. If you run 4 sticks, so for example, 4x16, total of 64 gigs, the maximum speed is 4000. If you're running a dual, let's say you're running 2 sticks on a, or let's say you're running 90 or 60, no. 4 sticks total 96. So that'll be like 4 times 24. That would be 4000 is the maximum supported speed. Now here's the big one. This is where it gets interesting. 4 times 32. Total 128 gigs. Maximum supported speed 3600 on the RAM. And then, of course, 192, 4x48. The maximum supported speed, again, is 3600. So you can see these are the numbers that I wanted to show because I remember I was like, okay, Intel has some different intermediate numbers. Whereas AMD is like, okay, it's either 52 for the easy stuff or 36 for the really hard stuff. There's like nothing in between. Intel, it has these like different numbers, but they only really apply for like 4x24, 4x16. You get 4000 as the maximum supported. So even though it says the maximum supported, that doesn't mean that that's the absolute maximum. Obviously, you can run it out of spec via overclocking with XMP, but you're at the mercy of the silicon lottery. Like, is your IMC capable of doing it? How much VCCSA can you tolerate? Or, you know, like that's basically playing silicon lottery. So there are some other adjustments that could be done with like running voltage on the RAM at like 1.4 volts or something or some high number, but you're going to need active cooling on your RAM to do that if you're going to run your RAM 24/7 like that. And I did manage to find what I think is the impedance values on a Z790 board, but I'm not exactly sure what to change them to because there's no reference material talking about it. So it's all like trial and error. So I may revisit trying to do 128 gigs of RAM on a 13900K at 5600. Because I think with possibly with some impedance tweaks, you can get it to work. And if I can get that to work, I might try 6000 on a different kit. Or something like maybe 6400. I don't know about 6400, but I'll probably try like 6000 because I was able to get that to work on AMD. I was able to get it to work pretty easily with certain tweaks to impedance. So, but Intel's the one that's been more challenging to get actually stable with all these weird overclocks. Okay, let's see, what else is there to talk about here? I mean, I think that's pretty much all I had. 14th gen, we know the fix. DDR5, Zen 5 motherboard support on basically everybody now. Even BioStar now has the BIOS support for Zen 5, which means I'm expecting Zen 5 to get announced or talked about, at least talked about at CES, or not CES, at Computex in June. And they may announce the availability. I'm guessing it's going to be like sometime in the summer. So like maybe August. I don't know. It could be as early as July. It could be as late as September. But somewhere in that range, that's going to be it. So yeah, I can't wait for the new motherboards. Because I do want to talk about the new AMD motherboards. Because I'm really curious to know what they change. In terms of USB 4, PCI Gen 5, well, like, what are they going to do with the downstream from the CPU to the chipset? Like, are they going to change that interface in any way? Like, is the bandwidth on that going to go up? Because the Zen 4 CPUs can support PCI Gen 5 downstream to the chipset. The problem is the chipset for X670 and B650 doesn't do Gen 5 to the CPU. Yeah, maybe. Because we discussed that last week. Oh, I shouldn't have deleted. Well, okay. See, so the CPU, you got your CPU, and you got your downstream to the chipset. And then you have your chipset. Well, it doesn't have to be symmetrical. So you got the chipset. I don't know if they're going to do daisy chain. Let's not talk about daisy chaining chipsets right now. Let's just assume that we have you got CPU lanes, you have chipset lanes, etc. So if this is AM5, and this is B650E. Let's call this B650E. Or let's just call it B650. Forget about B650E for a second. So on the CPU side, this interconnect to the chipset is PCIe 5.0 X4. However, on the chipset side, it's PCIe 4.0 X4. So today, on the motherboards, this is a limit of the motherboards more than anything else. Thoughts on the ASRock Z690 Aqua OC2 DIMM motherboard? Z690, I don't know. Z690, from what I've heard, everybody that I've talked to, they all say that Z790 has better overclocking potential. That being said, Z690 is a 2-DIMM motherboard, so in general, Z690 should be a better memory overclocker. However, because it's the older generation, and everyone I've talked to has been saying that Z790 is like way better for higher speed memory, it may not even matter because everybody who wants to run those high speeds, they're only running like 2 sticks of memory anyway, even if they're on a 4-DIMM motherboard. So I don't know. But yeah, ASRock Aqua is typically a high-end. Isn't that the one that has the liquid? Doesn't that one have the quick disconnects for the not quick disconnects, but they have the liquid cooling option for the VRM? I mean, you could do that. But why the Z690 though? For 2-DIMM. Is that, hold on, let me see. Is that a ATX? Let's see. The Z690 Aqua. This is it? Z6 Go? Why does it say Z6 Go? Oh, it's a full size. Okay. Oh, no, it's supposed to be a 2-DIMM board, isn't it? Why is it like this? How come it shows it's 4-DIMM? Is it supposed to be a 2-DIMM or a 4-DIMM? Z690 Aqua looks like it's a 4-DIMM motherboard, but this is the one that has the liquid thing on there. There's 2 SKUs. I like how it's got RGB on the audio things. Like, what? Why? It just has them. It has dual LAN. It has Thunderbolt. It has 6 USB Type A. It has it's got the full, wow, it has the full implementation of Thunderbolt. It even has the dual DisplayPort input for each to a Thunderbolt port output. That's interesting. I like that it's got the clear CMOS on the back. A lot of motherboards these days are omitting basic things like the clear CMOS. I'm pretty sure this has the debug. Yeah, it's got the debug down there. That's good. 8 SATA. You don't see a lot of 8 SATA anymore. That's because this was Z690. If this was Z790, this would have like less SATA. And it would just have like less. I feel like it would just have less. I'm not a big fan of Z790. I don't like Z790. I didn't have any issues with Z690. The only thing is my Z690 motherboard was a DDR4 motherboard. Yeah, the thing is, ASRock is underrated. Like, ASRock is actually really good. Like, I'm just telling you guys, like, right now, ASRock and MSI, although I haven't used a modern MSI motherboard in a long time, ASRock and MSI are the front runners for my next motherboard. Like, they're in front of Gigabyte and Asus. Because Gigabyte and Asus have done things that have annoyed me recently to the point where I think I'm going to try switching vendors. Like, if that makes sense. Because most of my motherboards right now are Gigabyte. For most of the systems that I use, it's primarily Gigabyte, with the one exception being Threadripper. Threadripper is on Asus. Now, Threadripper was on Gigabyte, but then there was that whole thing with I can't put the computer to sleep. It's like they wanted me to armate the board. I was like, man, really? I'd have to be like 2-3 weeks without a motherboard? No, I'm just gonna, whatever. Return it, get an Asus. The Asus board had like one in stock at Micro Center, so I did the swap. And the Asus board has been able to do everything that I needed to do. So I just use that. But other than that, like I use Gigabyte for everything else. So, like for example, I've got Gigabyte, like we're literally live streaming on a Gigabyte motherboard right now, the Aorus Master for AMD. I have the Z790 Gigabyte for the Intel 13th gen. Most of the time, Gigabyte's been good. Like, I will say Gigabyte is not bad. If you're someone who doesn't use a lot of niche workstation-related functionality, Gigabyte is fine. But if you ever do think, like, if you ever have to deal with Gigabyte support long-term for them to fix something, convincing their engineering team to actually implement a fix via a BIOS update is a real pain. And I always feel like they're so reluctant to do anything after the first couple of days of back and forth emails with their support people. So, yeah, that's why I'm like, yeah, I think we're gonna probably go with somebody else next time. MSI always has issues with buggy BIOS. Really? MSI has been pretty solid from what I remember. They were kind of buggy with like the first, well, they weren't even buggy. They were just kind of like sketchy. I guess that is buggy. I don't know. But they fixed all of it though. Like they fixed all of it via BIOS updates. So what I can tell you guys is when this CPU first came out, the 750X back in 2022, MSI and ASRock were the ones that if you set your RAM to run above, I think 5400 or I know 5200, 52 or 5400, and you're on MSI or you're on Gigabyte, they just straight up disable S3 suspended RAM. Like you just can't even do it. Like Windows tells you you can't even do sleep. You can't put your computer to sleep on this motherboard. Like it doesn't support it. You have to use Hibernate or you have to shut it down. And that was a problem for a while. Now they did fix that. Gigabyte and Asus, they left the feature on, but then you had all these people who were running like 6,000 mega transfers because all the reviewers said 6,000 is a sweet spot. AMD says do 6,000. So and then their computers like would not wake up. They'd have to retrain. You know, all the early teething issues with the DDR5 stuff. So that was a thing that differentiated MSI and ASRock. It's like MSI and ASRock, they avoided the problem with like the wake up not working by just turning it off arbitrarily, and then then users started complaining like, "Where's my sleep mode?" But then they eventually fixed it with BIOS updates. Whereas Gigabyte and Asus left it on, so you had all these people on Gigabyte and Asus saying, "Yeah, mine works fine. I don't know about you, but I can go to sleep. My computer can go to sleep and it works." But the thing is, what they didn't tell you was that they're probably running the RAM at like JEDEC 5200 or something like that. And then they try 6000, and then like 2 days later, their PC doesn't wake up correctly, and they have to do a hard restart. So you had all kinds of BIOS issues across the board on every single brand, is what I'm saying. So, and then with, oh man, trying to remember the Intel problems. Oh yeah, the Intel. Remember when Alder Lake launched the first CPUs from Intel that had the E cores? Oh man, were there problems? There were problems with stability because E cores, you would like Windows 10, specifically Windows 10, because it doesn't have thread director. Windows 10 would assign all your like high performance things to E cores, and then you get like really weird latency in a game. You'd have like lag spikes or like micro stutters and weird stuff. And some games literally wouldn't even like launch; they would crash. The Denuvo thought you were hacking, so they ban you for 24 hours. And it was all because of the big little core architecture. The game didn't even know. Like the anti-cheat was like, man, okay, this guy's definitely hacking because I can detect he's got 2 different CPUs. So he's like trying to remote access in. So they're like, yep, you're banned. So this was a big problem with, and a BIOS update eventually fixed it. But I remember they had to scramble to get BIOS updates to turn on this thing called game compatibility mode. So so basically what I'm trying to say is you can't just blame one brand as like terrible and then just call another brand perfect, because as far as I'm concerned, they've all had their ups and downs. None of them are perfect. None of the motherboard brands are perfect. I can tell you all kinds of problems with Asus, because I literally only ever used Asus for like a decade. So I've got a lot of things to say about Asus that are not so nice. But we're not going to talk about them right now. For the most part, once a platform is mature with lots of BIOS updates, then it doesn't matter what motherboard brand you go with. They're typically going to all be the same. The only time it's different is if they do fundamental design choices that cause them to age poorly or age better. The best example I can give you is the Asus Crosshair Hero is terrible. The X370. X370 Crosshair Hero. This motherboard from Asus, this is probably my favorite looking motherboard. It is such a nice looking motherboard. This is the first gen Ryzen motherboard from This is the flagship motherboard from Asus. The X370 ROG Crosshair 6 Hero. This motherboard was so good with Zen 1, but as soon as you tried to update the BIOS to go to Zen 2 or Zen 3, this motherboard was complete, utter garbage because they went with T topology for the RAM. And it was bad. It was just straight up bad. In fact, another motherboard that I also have, the X370 Gaming X Titanium, this one, X Power, this one. This motherboard from MSI, I call it the cookies and cream because it looks like cookies and cream with a color scheme there. So this motherboard from MSI, this was their flagship motherboard with the first generation Ryzen. This is their X370. This one was criticized because they went with like Nico's VRMs or something or whatever. The VRMs run hot. The problem is this one aged way better than the Asus one, because Asus went with T topology for the DRAM, and MSI went with daisy chain. So MSI's daisy chain, this motherboard runs a 3800X and a 5800X, no problems. You can do 3600 on the RAM and it works. This one, you'll be lucky if you can, and that's with 4 sticks. 4 sticks. You can do 128 gigs of memory if you want it on this. This thing, no. This thing, the best you can hope for is like 64 gigs, 3200, and even then, it's going to have issues every now and then with being able to post because of issues. You take out the new Ryzen, if I downgrade from a 5800X or a 3800X all the way back to a 1800X, it works. It's like the T topology works good with the early Ryzen, but it's just lousy with the newer Ryzen. So in terms of future proof, man, it's like night and day in terms of how these motherboards have aged. The MSI one, yes, they were criticized because their BIOS chips were small. Like, you lost the nice looking MSI UEFI GUI. It became like, if you wanted to do Zen 2 on this old board, you were stuck with the click BIOS, which was the weird monochrome looking one. But honestly, who cares? It's just how the BIOS looks. All the functions are there, and it just works. Like, everything about it is just better with the newer CPUs. So that's an example I can give you of motherboards choosing fundamental different design choices, which affects like their longevity in the grand scheme of things. Yeah, the click BIOS, that monochrome silverish gray colored black and white BIOS, which oddly enough actually matches the color scheme of this specific motherboard, which is kind of hilarious now that I think about it. Why does your wallet burn a hole pre-Computex? Man, I wouldn't be buying anything right now for computer hardware. I wouldn't be buying motherboards or CPUs right now. That's all I'm saying. Unless you're trying to do like CPU mining or something. Then even then, you wouldn't be looking at any sort of flagship motherboard. You'd go with the cheapest one possible. Why do motherboard makers go all out on Intel boards and the AMD SKUs look and features? In what way, though? I think they're pretty much the same. The difference is AMD's budget chipset, B650, is so much better value than Intel's budget chipset that no one even really thinks of Intel's budget chipset. They all just look at Z790. So what ends up happening is Z790 has this enormous spread of like low-end Z790 all the way up to flagship high-end Z790. Whereas AMD's stuff is pretty much split. You have your B650 single chipset, and you got your X670 dual chipset. So you can get Wi-Fi 7 on Intel and not AMD right now. That's because you're talking about Intel's 14th gen motherboards. You do realize that Z790 has existed since 2022, and the Z790 boards from 2022 don't have Wi-Fi 7. So keep that in mind. You're comparing 14th gen Z790 refresh motherboards to AMD motherboards from 2 years ago. So it's like, is that really apples comparison? It's not. So the correct comparison for the Wi-Fi 7 motherboards are the motherboards that are coming out this summer for AMD's Zen 5. Then we will evaluate the differences between the motherboards. Because if I show you my Intel motherboard, this is my Intel motherboard. So let's take a look and see what it has. This has Realtek audio. Okay, that's the same. Marvell 10 gig. That's the same. Wi-Fi AX. So this is Wi-Fi 6. I think it might be Wi-Fi. Yeah, it's Wi-Fi 6E right there. So my Intel motherboard Z790 has Wi-Fi 6E. That's because I purchased this motherboard in 2022. 2022. That was the same year that I bought the AMD board. Now, the AMD board is right here. So you can see it's pretty much the same exact motherboard. They both have the big fat Gen 5 heatsink, etc. They both have the X16 PCI Gen 5. Same exact. Actually, the AMD one's got 6 SATA. The Intel one has 4. The AMD one has an X4 Gen 4, and then an X2 Gen 3. The Intel one has an X4 Gen 3 and an X1 Gen 3, I think. I have to look at the block diagram. It's been a while. Intel high-end boards look way better. ASRock X670E Gigabyte Extreme Master and Asus Extreme come to mind. I think they look pretty much the same. Like, the thing is, you have to look at the exact same SKUs, though. Like X670E or Asus ROG Extreme. So, this one, this was Asus's flagship AMD, like the Zen 4 motherboard. Now, you can't buy this motherboard anymore. It's been discontinued for a long time. This is a $1,000 motherboard, though, so keep that in mind. This one basically did everything. This motherboard had USB 4, aka Thunderbolt compatibility. It basically had all the things that you could think of were on this motherboard. So, I don't really see a difference. Like, when I look at them, especially, like, the MSI Meg Ace, X670E, and the Z790 literally look the same. They look exactly the same except for the socket. Like, literally, the socket is upside down. That's the only difference. So, but the thing is, if you want to buy a flagship, you got to know the names. You got to know the different names. That's what the thing. Like, you're looking for flagship, you got to know what you're comparing. So, here, let me do the breakdown. Asus brand for flagship on AMD. Look for the name Crosshair. Crosshair is the highest end Asus motherboard for AMD. So actually, you know what? How can I do this in an easy to understand manner? Let's get rid of this stuff. Let's get rid of all of this, actually. Even though I actually like this stuff that I drew here. Okay. So let's do Asus. Asus. And then we'll do over here, we'll do the AMD brand name. We'll do the Intel brand name equivalent. So, and I'm only going to do flagships so you guys know what the breakdown looks like. So, AMD, Crosshair. Crosshair. Does anybody know what the Intel equivalent to the Crosshair is from Asus? Crosshair is higher end than ProArt, by the way. ProArt's lower end. But again, it kind of depends on the use case. But we're just talking about like absolute flagship. Does anybody know what the Intel equivalent is to the AMD Crosshair? Like, what's the brand name? RK Sing Hero. That's not a brand name. That's a model. Apex. That's not a brand name. You guys are saying like you're not thinking of the brand name. You're thinking of the like a specific motherboard SKU. What you're saying falls under this category. So basically, what you guys have listed, Hero, Extreme, Hero, Apex, all of these are sub models of the Crosshair brand. That's what you guys are listing. I'm asking for the brand equivalent on an Intel motherboard. So what is the question here is, what is the Z790 equivalent of an AMD Crosshair motherboard from Asus? Wow. Nobody here seems to know anything about Intel boards. I feel like I'm the only one that can speak both Intel and AMD languages. Okay. Final desperate attempt by RK Crosshair. No, that's incorrect. Maximus. Maximus is the Intel equivalent from Asus. Maximus. That is the answer. So there's a Maximus Extreme. There's typically a Maximus Extreme. There's a Maximus Hero. There's a Maximus Apex. So when you look at these, they're basically the same thing. In terms of price points, in terms of feature set. So for example, these motherboards from AMD, if you want to talk about Thunderbolt, these got Thunderbolt. Well, I hope they got Thunderbolt. I assume they have Thunderbolt. I didn't check. But I know for a fact that these have Thunderbolt via USB 4. I don't know about the Intel ones, but I know the AMD ones have Thunderbolt. I don't know about the Intel ones. It's literally on the Asus board. Yeah, so these are equivalent brand names under the Asus brand. So, meaning, now that I have this knowledge, if I'm planning a super high-end build, if I'm going Asus, I'm going to be buying a Crosshair motherboard. If I'm building an AMD Zen 5 build later this summer. So the Intel equivalent would be a Maximus motherboard. See, so that's the thing, because a lot of people will be like, oh, Z790 is way more affordable. Well, not really, because if you're comparing the exact same SKUs, they're actually pretty much the same. So now let's do MSI. MSI, let's do them next, because I think they're like the second largest one, or maybe Gigabyte is a little bit low. I don't know. I think MSI has grown larger than Gigabyte in terms of the motherboard market over the years. So what's the MSI one? Do you guys know what the flagship MSI board is? Okay, so MSI has a flagship, and then it has what they call a true flagship, which I think is actually the fake flagship, or it's like the redundant one. So what is MSI's flagship board? Do you guys even know what it is? Like, okay, I'm going back to Asus real quick. Like, if I'm someone who only tunnel visions in on the fastest, or not even the fastest, like the most premium stuff, the most premium of the premium, the premium of the premium, like better than a Supreme, better than a ProArt, nonsense, supposedly professional branding, but ProArt's actually way worse than Crosshair and Maximus. Like, if I'm gonna build a workstation, am I gonna buy a ProArt? No. No. I'm gonna buy a Crosshair. Yes, I'm gonna buy a gamer-centric, RGB-infested motherboard to use as a workstation before I would buy like a ProArt. That's because ProArt's like $500 and lacking basic things. But it does have the full Thunderbolt stuff. But these have Thunderbolt too. So it's like, what's the point of buying a ProArt? I mean, I guess you're saving like $200 or something, but it's like you're missing basic things. Like, you're not getting a postcode debug. You're not getting a the Gen Z add-in card for the Gen 5. You get that stuff with these. You don't get that stuff with the ProArt. So ProArt is a big waste of money as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it looks okay, but I personally wouldn't buy it. 10 gigabit. You got 10 gigabit on this one. Try again. You got 10 gigabit on the Extreme. Crosshair's got 10 gigabit. So, nope. So does the Crosshair. Now, not all the Crosshairs have 10 gigabit, but Crosshair and Maximus do have 10 gigabit. So, it's the cheapest board with 10 gigabit. Yeah, you might be right there. Yeah, I think you're right. It's the cheapest one. If you call $500 cheap, you know, in my opinion, at a certain point, when you start spending, like, it just kind of gets out of control. I mean, we talked about this before. Yeah, that whole upsell motion gets out of control at a certain price point. Gigabyte's ProArt, I think, is the Aero brand or something. I forget what it's. I think it's Aero. So MSI, let me see. So let's see what people wrote. So someone mentioned Ace. Xtreme with an X is not MSI, but Ace is. So I'll tell you guys. So the MSI has, as far as I'm concerned, it's the Ace. It's the Ace. Now MSI has like a fake. They have okay. Realistically, the Ace is the flagship. But there is a true flagship. I call it the fake flagship, but they call it the true flagship. The true flagship is the godlike. But it's basically a huge waste of money. Godlike, I don't even want to mention it because it's such a waste of money. So for a while, MSI, like one of the differentiating factors that the godlike was supposed to have, but then didn't deliver at the last minute for some whatever reason, Godlike was supposed to offer NVIDIA SLI. It was supposed to be the only motherboard that offered NVIDIA SLI. It actually contained the SLI. Because what people probably don't realize is that if you want access to SLI, back in the day, if you wanted to run multi-GPU, you had to buy a motherboard. Like if you were on NVIDIA, now if you were on it Radeon, nobody cared because AMD did not sell a license key to unlock multi-GPU. It was free, which means you could do crosshair, you could do multi-GPU on Radeon cards on the most bargain bin motherboard imaginable, as long as it had the dual X16 slots to fit the second card underneath the first card. Now, if you were on GeForce, you had to buy a specific motherboard that had an SLI certification, which basically means that the motherboard manufacturer had to pay NVIDIA a license fee to use the SLI license with their motherboard. So, one of the things that the Godlike offered was that it used to offer SLI. Now it doesn't offer SLI. As a result, it literally has no differentiating feature that makes it better than the Ace in any significant way. And that's the reason why I kind of pretend that it doesn't even exist. So if I was going to buy a flagship MSI motherboard, the Ace is where I would look. That is the name brand that I would look for if I was looking for an MSI motherboard. Oh, and we're not talking about like the brands, because if we're talking brands, I should say ROG, the Republic of Gamers, because the Republic of Gamers Crosshair is a brand within a brand. So you have the Asus brand, then you have the Republic of Gamers brand, and then you have the Crosshair motherboard brand within the ROG. So you literally have a nested brand within a nested brand of a company's brand. So you have a brand within a brand within a brand. That's Crosshair. Then you got the different models like Extreme, Hero, and Apex. So Asus has like 3 different layers of branding. MSI has, funnily enough, copied Asus. They've got 3 levels of branding. They got Meg. So if you're looking for Ace, it's under the Meg brand. If you're looking for Crosshair, you're looking under the ROG brand. So you got a brand within a brand within a brand. 3 layers of brands. I like it. All it does is confuse the consumers even more. And it gives me more stuff to talk about. Okay, so this is Meg. And then you've got ROG up here. Republic of Gamers literally cringe me away from the... They have... Okay, MSI's got more than Meg. MSI's got Meg, they got MPG. You know, like, the list goes on with these brands. They've got the Creation. Asus has Pro Art. They've got Strix. Strix is the most lame one as far as I'm concerned. Which, okay, Strix used to be its own thing. Then they made it part of the ROG. So now you got Strix within ROG. So it's like you got Asus, ROG, Strix. But then you have like the true flagship, which is no Strix. Strix is garbage. It's Asus ROG Crosshair or Asus ROG Maximus. Unless Asus wants to do some consolidation and combine Strix with those other two. They have Project Zero now too. Oh, please. I don't even want to go there. Don't forget Tough. Oh, Tough is the budget line, though. Like, well, okay. They've got Tough. They've got Prime. They've got ProArt. Is there anyone that I'm forgetting? Somebody mentioned that other one. Project Zero. Is that Asus? Project Zero? What? That sounds like a video game. That sounds like a code name for a video game. Prime. Prime is trash. Prime used to be pretty good, though. Prime was good like 10 years ago. Gigabyte almost lost me. They stylized their eagle branding, you know. Yeah, so that's MSI. So MSI is basically Ace, and that's basically it. Next we have Gigabyte. Let's do Gigabyte next. Okay. This one. Okay, this one. Gigabyte. Gigabyte. Okay, we all know what theirs is. Aorus. You gotta go Aorus. If you're going Gigabyte, you basically gotta go Aorus if you want like the premium brand. So with Gigabyte, does anybody know what Gigabyte's flagship board is? Now, Gigabyte is just like MSI. Gigabyte has a flagship, and then they have a fake flagship, but in their minds, it's a true flagship. So do we know what the true flagship is? Basically the one that's like extra money for no reason. RK saying Extreme. Yeah, it's the Extreme. So the Extreme with an X, that's their true flagship, but it's actually what I call the fake flagship. The real one is actually the Master. The Master is the one to look for, because that's the one that tops out in terms of the value. And you got this on both AMD and Intel. So at least, as you can see, guys, it's pretty consistent with these other guys. Asus is the only one that uses different words. They use Crosshair and Maximus. And here's some interesting trivia. Crosshair is a brand that is very, very near and dear to Asus corporate's heart. This brand name will never go away. I don't know about Maximus. Maximus might disappear. They might consolidate with Strix. I don't think it's going to go away because it's the equivalent of Crosshair. Crosshair will never, ever, as far as I know, I should never say never, but Crosshair historically is the very first brand of, it was the very first brand within a brand. So when Asus created ROG, the Republic of Gamers, the very first premium flagship motherboard that they offered as a Republic of Gamers product was the very first Crosshair motherboard, which was, as you know, an AMD motherboard. So there's some history there in terms of Asus and the Crosshair brand and the whole Republic of Gamers. So this is a lot of like, this is like a bunch of trivia history, like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire questions. I'm giving you all the answers to these questions. Like if you ever go on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and the question comes up, you know, what was the first sub-brand of the Republic of Gamers? A, Crosshair. B, Maximus. C, ProArt. D, Ace. Those type of questions. Do you have the answer to those questions? I certainly do. Hey, Osby. Oh, wow. Yeah. Sometimes it's rare, but sometimes I will stream at the opposite end of the hours on the weekend, but it's rare. But yeah, I appreciate you tuning in despite the late hour. Yeah, Gene. So guys, Gene is another like sub brand though. I think Gene, yeah, that's like a sub brand. But anyway, the point is there's consistency. So like as long as you know, so here's the thing that I'm trying to convey here. As long as you know the key words, as long as you know the true flagship brand names, you can't really like you can't really go wrong, right? Because what you're going to find out is that there's parity, there's feature parity across the board for most of these products. So meaning it doesn't matter if you go AMD or Intel, as long as you know the flagship motherboards, you know, you're getting the highest end offering from any of these motherboard manufacturers. So that's Gigabyte, so that's Master. I currently have what I can tell you guys, like literally, we are literally streaming right now on an X670E Aorus Master. Like this is the motherboard that I'm streaming on right now. And I have this one, and I also have this. I have the Intel Gigabyte Aorus Master, and I have the AMD Aorus Master. I've got both. So it's pretty much the same. Now, last but not least, unless you guys want to do BioStar, but I don't really want to go there. ASRock. ASRock's an interesting one because they kind of, I don't know how to classify some of their products. Like they'll randomly do stuff like Aqua. Like what is the Aqua supposed to be? Is that supposed to be like the godlike? Is that supposed to be like the extreme? In general, what I would consider for ASRock as their quote-unquote kind of the flagship board, it wasn't originally supposed to be their flagship. Originally, I think the Phantom Gaming Fatality line was their flagship, or what they planned to be their flagship. But what ended up happening was, for some reason, the Taichi brand, maybe it was because they seeded more of these to reviewers back in the early days. The Taichi brand really took off, and it became really popular, and they sold way more of them. So they basically moved Taichi to become more of a flagship brand. So this is kind of the one that I would look for if I was looking at a flagship ASRock. The thing with ASRock, though, is they're the ones who tend to come up with the most random different product offerings, if that makes sense. I know Asus just has a whole bunch of brands, but as far as I'm concerned, most of the mid to low end Asus boards are all redundant. Like they're all about how they look. So it's like if you like the way Tough looks, you go Tough. If you like the way Prime looks, you go Prime. Functionally, they're basically going to be the same. There isn't really much of a difference. But ASRock has weird, like ASRock will do things like they'll give you a Taichi that has Thunderbolt on AMD, and then it will also have like an X8 slot for multi-GPU that nobody uses anymore. You know, but then they won't have like a traditional X4 on the B650. So they'll do like really, really weird things like that sometimes. But depending on the use case, what I have found is ASRock does seem to have some really interesting options. And ASRock, as far as I'm concerned, they tend to have the most variety in terms of, and value, I should say. Value is the word I was looking for. ASRock gives you the most value. ASRock's the only one that I know of that they will give you a $200-something motherboard that also includes, in some cases, sub $200 motherboard with a really nice GPU anti-sag bracket. Like no one else, as far as I know, none of these other brands do this. ASRock just released the beta BIOS. Yeah, that was something we talked about earlier at the beginning of the stream. It's not just ASRock. Gigabyte has it out too. Actually, even BioStar. So all of them do. So just to kind of show that real quick for those that are tuning in now. So Gigabyte has a Giza. So you guys check right here. Gigabyte. Here's the Aorus Master. I have to update to this BIOS later this week. But right now, Gigabyte now, as of April 22nd, Gigabyte now has support for Zen 5 on their motherboards. At least the Master has it. The MSI has it. So MSI has had this for a couple of days now, basically since the 18th. MSI has support for Zen 5. Asus was the very first one. ASRock also. The Steel Legend, this is the one that I have from ASRock. This one, they, as of today, they have support for Zen 5 on their existing motherboards. So here's the thing. This is the thing that I was telling you guys back when we did these builds almost 2 years ago, it was about a year and a half ago when the Zen 4 platform launched, I said that if you buy this platform, you invest in this platform, you're going to have an upgrade path with these boards. And that's the reason why the choice of motherboard is a very important choice that is often overlooked by a lot of other things. And that's why I made that tier list video for X670E and B650, because I felt at the time that if you choose one of these motherboards, you can hang on to this motherboard for a very long time. You can literally do drop-in socket upgrades for multiple generations. Now, it's what's interesting is that we have seen this change approach, what am I saying? We have seen this same thing happen with Intel now. Intel, for the first time, has had like 3 CPUs in one socket. Typically, they do 2, or it used to be 1, but then it became 2. Now it's kind of 2.5. Although I guess the person playing devil's advocate there would say, hey, that's not true. Intel's only 2 because 13 and 14 gen are the exact same thing. 14th gen is just 13th gen overclocked from the factory, blah, blah, blah. It's the same nonsense. Yeah, it's the same silicon. Like, that's what they would say. But the fact that you can still take a motherboard from 2022 and you can do a upgrade to a 14th gen from like a 12th gen, that's still good. That is a move in the right direction. And that's basically Intel kind of trying to mimic AMD's socket compatibility over multiple generations. That's basically what that is. But at the time, when I was investing in the X670E platform, I knew that I would be able to keep the motherboard for multiple CPU generations. Now, with Intel, I didn't know if that would actually happen. It turns out that it did happen, but it was not something that we knew ahead of time. It was not a low-risk decision, if that makes sense, from an investment standpoint. So, for a platform. Anyway, MSI needs to retire the dragon motif. I think there's a lot of people that actually like the dragon, but yeah, it is getting a little long in the tooth, that design. Maybe a newer design. This new Agisa supposedly helps with RAM overclocking, and yeah, I'm definitely going to try it. I'm definitely going to upgrade, at least on the ASRock. I'm going to upgrade because, as you guys know, I have the 8000 kit in the ASRock board, and in fact, I have another one. So I currently have 4 sticks of memory in the ASRock board for a total of 96 gigabytes of RAM. So that's 24 times 4 with this ASRock Steel Legend. And I've been playing around with different overclocking settings. I can get it to run pretty good with 4 sticks, all things considered. But I'm not going to spoil the video. I'm working on that video still. That being said, if you want to run 96 gigs of RAM, I don't recommend 4 sticks. It's much easier to just buy 2x48 and just do 2 sticks of 48 for a total of 96. That's just plug and play at this point. On all the AMD boards that I've tested, I literally go in, install the 2 48 gig DIMMs, turn on the XMP profile, and that's it. It's good to go. Like, you don't need to do anything. It just works. So... but yeah, I'm trying to do more tweaks with that, but I think I know kind of where the limits are for those who want to run 96 gigabytes across 4 sticks of memory, which is technically, you would think that you could do clock pretty high because it's single rank DIMMs, because that's the nice thing about 24 gigs. That's why 24 gigs is so good. That's why I recommend it. Because if you want to run high speed, you don't want to compromise too much on capacity. Because I see a lot of people running 32 gigabyte kits, which is fine if you don't do anything with that's memory intensive or needs a lot of memory. But as far as I'm concerned, 32 gigabytes is what I consider the bare minimum in 2024 for a new build. Like, I personally wouldn't go less than 48. 48 gigs, I think, is the new 32. 32 is definitely the new 16, where 16 was the old minimum. I consider 32 the new minimum. So, but 48 gives you a little bit more breathing room. And the nice thing about 48 gigs total is you can do high speed relatively easy on any of these platforms because it is single rank. That's the thing. Keep in mind that 24 gig DIMMs are considered single rank DIMMs. So you would think that because they're single rank, and that was my initial impression, was I should be able to do 4 sticks of memory because it's for a total of 96 because it's single rank. Because I know it's not dual rank. Dual rank is where it gets really, really hard. Like, that's where you gotta really, really know what you're doing if you want to run higher speeds on 4 sticks dual rank. Plan on benching Hellblade 2 in May. I don't have Hellblade. Oh, is that the new one? Is that the new game? Because I don't have... I never played the first one. I don't even know if I have the first game. Yeah, I don't have it. Oh, I don't have the first one. I mean, we'll see. My my plans for games, for those wondering, like, just to kind of go over that. Where's Paint again? So, April is pretty much Stellar Blade. Stellar Blade comes out literally tomorrow. That's the only game that I'm tracking that's a new game for this month. Then we have May. The game that I plan to cover in May is Ghosts of Tsushima on PC. Like, that's the game that I plan on covering. So I don't know about... So you're saying Hellblade 2 is in May. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just write it down. Hellblade 2. I don't know if I'm going to cover it. Oh, it's a Game Pass. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. I don't have Game Pass, so but I'll look into that. So I'm going to mark it down Game Pass. Okay, so that's May. Those are the games that I'm tracking for May. June is where gaming kind of ends. Like, as far as I'm concerned, June is the last month for gaming. Like, after June, it becomes all focused on hardware. Like I said, so for those that have watched my live streams pretty much throughout the course of this year, you're going to hear me sound like a broken record. The first half of this year, the emphasis has been on gaming. The second half of this year is going to be emphasized on PC hardware. It's all about hardware. So if you're saving money for an upgrade for the summer or just later in this year, all the new hardware is coming out in the second half of the year. We have new GPUs, we have new CPUs, we have new motherboards, we have new everything. Like, we have new Intel GPUs even. Battle Mage is coming out, supposedly. Oh, I better. Because I'm saying it live. Intel, you better launch Battle Mage in the second half of this year. I don't want to hear about some ridiculous delay. So, June is going to be an interesting one. So, there's going to be Shadow of the Erd Tree, which I will be live streaming my playthrough. Well, I guess most of the playthrough for this. This is going to be June. Shadow of the Erd Tree. Followed by Final Fantasy XIV Dawn Trail. So I will be covering Dawn Trail. At least the story of the game. At least kind of the playthrough of the new campaign. The from level 90 to level 100. Because they're raising the level cap to level 100. I always choose the new jobs. So I will play as Viper and Pictomancer. Both. So a lot of time will be spent on Dawn Trail. And I level up those first. Which means I'm going to have to do old content to level those to 90 before I can do the story. So I'm going to have to speed level, power level those early, like in the first 2 days or whatever of early access. And I think there's going to be a lot of other FF14 players that are going to do the same thing. So that's Dawn Trail. And then the last game, which is technically early July, it's like the first week of July. It's, let me see, what was the name of that game again? I forgot the name of that game. What is that game called? Trails Through Daybreak. So it's going to be The Legend of Heroes Trails Through Daybreak. That comes out July 5th. And then after that, there's like, what, nothing? Okay, there's like that Wukong, Black Myth Wukong in August, which I'm still very iffy about whether it's going to actually be good or not. And then that's basically it. I think there was some other game that I can't remember right now. But everything after June is going to be all about like computer hardware. It's going to be like Zen 5. We're going to be covering Zen 5, all the new chipset updates for the new motherboards. We're going to be covering Battle Mage. We're going to be covering RTX 50. We're going to be covering, you know, whatever. I don't know exactly when those are going to come out. Those are way later. But definitely Zen 5, because it's looking more and more like Zen 5 is the very first new next-gen hardware that we're getting. I mean, the PS5 Pro also is supposed to come out, but I think that's Q4. So, thoughts, plans on getting the new upcoming 4K 32 OLED? A lot of people in my Discord channel talk about OLED. I don't know. I don't know yet. I mean, if there was a 27-inch 4K OLED, I would definitely be considering it. 32-inch might be too big for me because I don't have the desk space for 32-inch. Because the thing is, I have 3 monitors right now. I've got my middle monitor, which is a 27-inch 4K. Then I've got 2 24-inch 1440p monitors on the left and the right. So if I get a 32-inch, I don't know if I can fit the other 2 monitors on the side. So it's too far, because I already use the left monitor for the Paint and the web browser and all that stuff. And then I use the middle monitor for monitoring the chat, and then, you know, like all the stream stuff is on the middle monitor. And then obviously if I'm playing a game, the game's going to be in the middle monitor, so I got to move all this stuff over to the right monitor or whatever. So that's why I have 3 monitors. I mean, if I had an ultra wide, I could probably do everything on one monitor. The problem with ultra wide is I don't like playing games in windowed mode. I like being able to run it in full screen or borderless full screen. So that's why I go triple monitor. Which one is that 240? You mean the... Oh, I guess you're referring to that OLED. I don't know. Put the 32 on the ceiling. You mean on the wall? On the ceiling? Why would it go on the ceiling? Like, what? The wall mounting, maybe. But then it would be so far away that it would kind of defeat the purpose of it being 4K and 32 inches. What was the thing? What about the Hellhound? Get a giant arm and float it. You mean like a monitor arm? So I'm already using, so I use the Elgato arm for the microphone. I mean, I guess I could get a monitor arm, which is very similar to this thing, but I don't know if I have room for that, because this desk is not a very good desk. It's basically a cheap fold-up desk. As weird as that sounds to say that, considering like all this expensive hardware that I have, and then I have like a fold-up table as the desk. I have a plastic fold-up table, guys. It's one of those Lifetime tables from Walmart or Costco. That's literally what my monitors are sitting on right now. Well, actually, they're on a mount, but it's like that's all on a fold-up table. Yeah, I'm using a fold-up table. A cheap fold-up table is what all my expensive hardware is sitting on top of. It's one of those ones for like outdoor events, you know? Yeah, all this stuff is just sitting on a plastic fold-up table. You have an Amazon desk still like 5 years ago? You have an advanced question? Oh, no, we still have time. We still have time. Yeah, go ahead. If you guys have any questions, it's better to ask the questions live. Like, because what happens is people might leave a comment on a YouTube video, which is basically a technical question, and I may or may not be able to see the comment or get back to it in time. So it's easier to address those questions live. And I think I give a better answer if I'm doing it live versus like replying to a comment on a YouTube video. You used to use folding tables, but changed out when you found a prefab with the frame. Well, you'll have the option to upgrade to Intel's new GPU later this year. Battlemage should be coming out, guys, and we kind of know how fast it is, or we kind of have ideas of how fast it is, or at least I do. So, let's see. So if you're on a 770 right now, so if you're on the A770 limited edition, it looks like this. And if you want to know, like if you want to upgrade to Battle Mage, I want to set the correct expectations. So I don't want people to think that it's going to be like so insanely better. It's like so fast. No, realistically, you got to go by how fast a generational uplift is. And typically, if we look at the A770 and we try to guess the performance uplift, the good amount of uplift would be around 45 to 65%. That is what most people aim for when they're doing a generational uplift. Anything better than that is considered like a home run win. Anything under that it means they still made a new generation, but it didn't really exceed, or I guess it didn't meet the expected uplift that they were aiming for. So keep that in mind. So if you want to try to guess how much faster the next generation GPU should be for Intel, specifically for Intel, because Intel has a lot of room to improve. The A770 is basically as fast as a GTX 1080 Ti. So keep that in mind. It's like a 1080 Ti. It's a little bit faster because the 1080 Ti has some problems now. It's so old. It can't do mesh shaders correctly, that kind of stuff. So what I think is this is the card that the A7 or the Battle Mage, the fastest Battle Mage from Intel, will be similar to an RTX 4070 in the best case scenario. The best case scenario, an RTX 4070 is kind of where I think the Battle Mage will be, which means it'll be a little bit slower, because if we click 4070 here, right, if we look at this, the 7800 XT is still going to be a little bit faster in rasterization. So we'll see like where Battle Mage lands. I think it's gonna land somewhere around these GPUs though, in terms of how fast it is. So keep that in mind. So if you're expecting the Battle Mage flagship from Intel to be as fast as a 3090 or a 4070 Ti or a 7900 XT or even a 7900 GRE, I think that's wishful thinking, and if you truly believe that, you might be setting yourself up for disappointment when it doesn't deliver that. So that's why it's better to set lower expectations and then be impressed if they exceed those expectations than to set really, really high expectations and then just not to have them met. Because the problem is, I think this happens to a lot of like PC enthusiasts. They want the next gen to be so fast, and then it never achieves that. And then they're just disappointed, and then they say that it's not good. This happened with the 20 series from NVIDIA. Do you guys remember when NVIDIA launched the 2080 and the 2080 Ti? those things, like the 2080 was basically like 1080 Ti, and then the 2080 Ti wasn't like, it was so expensive. The Founders Edition was $1,200, and it wasn't even like significantly faster over the previous generation. Like, in fact, we can even look at that. Like, if we just to use these numbers, if this is the 1080 and we go look at 2080 Ti, 2080 Ti is like 31%. And remember what I told you, generational uplift typically should be like 45 to 65 in that range. So it definitely under-delivered in terms of the performance uplift. Now, there's a lot of rumors that the 5090 is going to do something similar. Like, it's not going to be this massive gain over the 4090. So that's why I don't think, unless NVIDIA has some new software feature that they make exclusive to the 50 series that you can't do on the 40 series, so you have to upgrade, I think it's not going to be as interesting as the 40 series was when it came out back in 2022. So you play CS2 and League of Legends. Should you buy RAM with low cast latency or high frequency? Should I buy monolithic CPU? What kind of motherboard fits this job? So League of Legends, pretty much, it doesn't even matter because all the CPUs that I know of, all of them across the board, can handle that game. That game is so old, first of all. So there's really nothing, like, I wouldn't even be concerned for League of Legends. CS2 is a little bit different because they have changed things over the years. But in general, the motherboard doesn't really matter. Just pick whichever one fits the budget and looks cool in your opinion. But also keep in mind that you want to choose a motherboard based off of the features that the motherboard offers. Because that's the thing that often people overlook. Then later on they figure out if they try to do something and they can't do it because their motherboard doesn't have the ability to do it. You know, for example, if you want to run a 4K capture card with HDR support and 60 hertz recording, you know, or even high refresh recording, because a lot of these new capture cards, they can do like 120 or 240 1080p video recording, video capture. So like that sort of thing, like you make sure if you want to ever be able to do that, that you buy a motherboard that can support that, because not all motherboards can support something like that. And that's the sort of thing that goes into deciding what motherboard to choose. It's not just about RGB this, RGB that, and the price point, and, you know, like, oh, it has to be this much money, but it has to have this feature, etc., or it just has to be the best one, or it has to be the cheapest one, whatever. Like, those are the sort of things that I use as criteria for deciding what motherboard to get. It's like, what do I need it to do? It needs to be able to do, like, if I need USB 4, for example, or if I need 10 gigabit LAN. Those are sort of things that factor in. Monolithic CPU, I don't really, for the games that you're playing, monolithic CPU doesn't really matter versus chiplet. First of all, this idea between monolithic versus chiplet, like this, so the thing about this is monolithic as we know it is going away. So keep that in mind. Monolithic dies are not going to continue to be used for high core count, high thread count. Now with die shrinks, you can fit more cores into a specific monolithic die, but that is changing for everything. And this applies to both AMD and Intel CPUs. So keep in mind, monolithic designs are becoming a thing of the past, or they're not going away. It's just for high performance computing, they're not something that you'll see used in the higher end parts of the market. You're going to see more chiplet based things from both AMD and Intel. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Infinity Fabric adds latency. Adds latency in what way, though? In what way does it add latency? 3090 Ti, not 3090. Because the fabric is kind of like a highway. It's like a wide highway with a lot of lanes. Monolithic are not good if you're going to use a GPU. They only have 16 meg cache. Yeah, that's a good point. So the thing is, it's not so much about chiplet versus monolithic. It's becoming more and more cache is the thing that is determining the latency and the performance. So that's the sort of thing that you need to keep in mind. It's more about cache now. More and more, what I've seen is that in order to improve performance in in lightly threaded apps that don't have to do a lot of memory calls or memory writes, copies, reads, etc., the cache is actually what makes the biggest difference. Not so much the fabric stuff or the quote unquote chiplet versus monolithic. Because the thing that you're talking about with the Infinity Fabric, even if you go with a single CCD versus a dual CCD, the single CCD cores, to go to the memory, they still have to go through the fabric. So that's the reason why there isn't really much of a difference. And the thing with Intel is Intel's not really any better because Intel. So here's the thing: you got to remember this, or I guess you have to understand like the design of the CPU. I guess let's remove. Do I need to remove all this stuff? Okay, we've talked about all this. We already know all this stuff. Let's remove all these guys. So the AMD CPU, well, I guess we should make a larger diagram. So you got your CCD, you have your other CCD, and then you have your fabric, and then you have your memory controller, and then you have your DRAM. So the latency that you're talking about is typically is going to the memory. So you have, let's say you have 1, 2, how do I break this up? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you have 8 cores here, and then you have 8 cores here. I don't know if this is how it looks, but you get the idea. So let's say you have one thread. You have one thread here. So it needs to send, it needs to write something to memory. So it's going to go to the fabric. The fabric's going to connect it to the IMC. The IMC is going to send it to the memory. And then it's going to come back. So you have this path. You have this internally. Then you have this. And then you have the read coming back. And it goes back. So you basically have to get on this expressway, aka this I/O die, to go to that. Now, forget about the second one, because if it's like single CCD, dual CCD, it doesn't matter. Anytime you have to go to the RAM, it's going to go through the fabric. Wait, what are we talking about? Why does Intel have lower latency on the same RAM kit? Is the latency really better, though? I don't think it's that much better. It's pretty much the same. Intel, okay, the analogy that I use with, so AMD is like you get in a car. So let's think of it like a car. I use the car and the highway analogy. If you want to go to the memory, you get in a car, you get on the road, you literally drive. You enter the highway, the expressway, the Autobahn, whatever. You get on the high-speed trail, and the expressway, and you get on that highway, and then you go, and then you exit, and then you get back on the road. Then you get on the highway again. Then you get off the highway. That's how it works on AMD. Intel is completely different. Well, it's not completely different. Intel, the way we know Intel today, is you have the I gotta remember where these go. So the cores go here. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So you have, this is a, let's call this a 13900K. And let's call this one a 7950X. So you want to go to the memory on the Intel. You have to get on the subway station. You get on a train. You have to go on the loop. There's a loop. It's called the ring bus. You got to get, okay, well, I don't want to say, okay, now you're going to think of it like it's a bus. It's a bus. I'd like to think of it as a train or like a subway station, or not a subway station, like a train track. Because it's going in a loop, I think of it like a subway or a train that goes in a loop again and again. So you want to go somewhere, you want to go to the memory, you got to get, let's say you're over here, you get on the train, you go over to the memory station over here, you got IMC over here, and then you get over and you drive over to the RAM, which is like way over here somewhere. Same thing with the AMD one, it's like off there, it's off chip. So then it comes back. So the difference is the behavior of the ring bus versus the behavior of the fabric. That's basically all it is. So you can think of it as the AMD architecture has the fabric decoupled from the cores, so it's its own chip. Whereas with the Intel one, this is a monolithic, all the stuff is jam-packed into this one thing. Does that make sense? Kelly with the sub, thanks for the sub. But that's the way I think of it. I always think of Intel, it's like you're riding a train going around in a circle until you get off at your stop. Whereas with the AMD one, you get in a car and you drive to the highway, you get on the highway and then you exit and then you're there and you come back. You know, so that's how I visualize it in my head. That analogy has always kind of made sense to me in terms of the latency stuff. So, but it ends up being kind of the same in terms of the overall behavior. But Intel's upcoming generation will be interesting because they're going to a chiplet-based design with their next CPU. So we'll see how that ends up doing, but that's going to be different. Yeah, I think I remember your name in a previous live stream, Kelly. Yeah, but AMD does monolithic, Intel does chiplet, AMD does chiplet, Intel does monolithic. Like, they do both. Because AMD does monolithic. I think the chat was talking about the Ryzen 8000, which is a monolithic die. So that's basically AMD's version of this. But it's meant for a different use case. The AMD monolithic design is meant mostly for mobile devices. It's not meant for high performance computing. Yeah, if you like the video, like the video. I don't like to nag my viewers. I feel like if you guys genuinely like the content, you would leave a like because it does help. This channel is a really small channel. If you want this channel to get more exposure, leave a like, sub to the channel. There may be chiplet APUs in 2025. Yeah, no, I'm not saying like they're abandoning monolithic. They're not, like Intel and AMD are not abandoning monolithic. They're just, monolithic has its advantages in terms of power efficiency. Like, you can get better efficiency out of monolithic designs. The fact that everything is kind of closer together means that your natural latency can be better because it's closer together, because things are packed together. Now, with advanced interposer design, you can actually take like a chiplet-based design and literally move things together. Like, you can move them around in such a way that you reduce the physical latency by literally making the chips closer together. And I think that's something that we can expect to see in the future, because I suspect that Intel's chiplet design with their 15th gen CPU is going to look kind of like this. I think it's going to be, they're going to put the chips closer together to almost look like a monolithic design, but it's not, fundamentally it's not a monolithic design, because it's going to have to traverse through an interposer array, which is basically like the Infinity Fabric. Lead traces are shorter. Yes, so that's why. But it'll be interesting to see how the CPU architecture changes. Because if you guys think of the CPUs from 10 years ago, they're very different from the way they are now. Hey Nishant, you're having USB and SATA disconnecting issues? Are you overclocking? I mean, I don't know what would cause that besides overclocking or an unstable something. That sounds like unstable something. Or it could be, yeah, power management. You were still on 1 thread per core on AMD and 2 thread quad core on Intel 10 years ago. Yeah. Yeah. The FX8350 and the what was it, the not Excavator. Was Excavator was out? No, I don't think Excavator was out in 2014. It was AMD had FX8350, FX9590, and all the FX stuff. And then they also had their APUs. AMD had Trinity, Llano, what else do they have? They had the mobile stuff, the Beema, the Mullins. They had all that other like code names that I can't remember anymore. They had a bunch of APUs. And then AMD, well, Piledriver is what I mean when I say 8350. Piledriver was from 2012 though. Like late 2012. So that wasn't even new 10 years ago. That was already old. Which was like the highest end they had for a long time. I remember when Asus launched Crossblade Ranger. The Crossblade Ranger for the AMD Steamroller. It was a Steamroller. The what was it called? The man, what do they call those things? Those APUs, the 7850K or something. What was that thing called? AMD 7850K. Yeah, the A10. There we go. This thing. Yeah. The A10. There we go. They had A10. I think they had up to A12. They had the Kaveri. That's what it was. 4 gigahertz boost. This was a 4-core, 4-thread. Because remember, the AMD did not have SMT back then. So this was like their newer thing. I think this was 2014. 10 years old. The Kaveri APU. Or the Kaveri. The Kaveri APU. This was the chipset. So PCI Gen 2. PCI Gen 2 and SATA 3. USB 5 gigabit. This was like their highest end. This was the FM2. Well, this is not the highest end. This is like their I don't even know what you call this. This was their APU line from 2014. All I know is I had an 8350 for like 5 years. I used this one CPU for like 5 years. The FX8350. This is it. The Vishera. This was the Piledriver. That's it. Prior to this, I had like a Phenom 2 Black Edition 965. This thing. This was it, guys. I overclocked this thing to 4.8 gigahertz and then eventually lowered it to 4.7. because the amount of voltage increase from 4.7 to 4.8 was so much that it was pulling power like a 9590. You had FX 6100 back then. Man, I like the case. The packaging on this was so good. This is like a metal case. I remember I used this to store like pens on the desk and stuff. There's that socket AM3 Plus. October 2012. Launch price was $200. $200 for an 8-core, 8-thread. Now we all know this behaved more like a quad core with hyperthreading more than anything else. But yeah, this was my PC in late 2012. I upgraded from a Phenom to we need to talk about UE5. I forgot about that. We can talk about that next. I upgraded from a Phenom to Phenom 2 X4965. This is the one that I had before the pile driver. Socket AM3. So it was a quad core with 4 threads, 125 watt TDP. It's funny how processors still are rated, most of them, for a 125 watt TDP all these years later. And like they don't actually use 125 watts. This is like all CPUs now use more than 125 watts. Yeah, I had this 2009. I got mine. I built this in 2010. In 2010 I built this. And then later in late 2012 I upgraded to pile driver, and it was. So the thing is, when Bulldozer first came out, it was equal or a little bit slower than Phenom 2. Kind of like how Intel's Meteor Lake on laptop is equal to or actually slower than Intel's 13th gen on laptop. So it's the same story. But then a year later they launched Piledriver, and Piledriver fixed all the regressions. Like this was legit faster than the Phenom, which is why I upgraded to it. But it wasn't that much faster. It was like 20% faster. Mostly the gains were in multi-thread. It was like 30% faster in multi-thread in a lot of cases, but it was like not that much faster in single thread. It was like 5 to 10% at best in single thread. But it was a really good overclocker. You could easily add 500 megahertz to the boost clock on this. You could get up to 4.7, 4.8 gigahertz with ease. And at that speed, because you couldn't do that on a Phenom. Phenom, you could do 4 gigahertz if you were lucky. But it was mostly like 3.9, 3.8 on these. So the AMD, the pile driver, because you could overclock it so much further, it basically pulled away from the Phenom. So it justified the upgrade. And you got the newer motherboard with the newer platform. So you got all this extra stuff. So, because they give you lots and lots of PCIe lanes. Now, granted, there were only PCIe Gen 2 lanes, but Intel didn't do PCIe Gen 3 until Ivy Bridge. So, which was the 3rd gen. It was the one after Sandy Bridge. That was when Intel got PCIe Gen 3. And AMD didn't get PCIe Gen 3 all the way until... actually, I take that back. I think AMD got PCIe Gen 3 on their APU. They just didn't have it on their actual CPU, their discrete CPUs. So, games benefit more on single core performance, right? It depends. Most of the time, I would say that's accurate, because the games tend to be lightly threaded. But a lot of modern games are multi-threaded. Most games now use 6 threads or more. They can use 8 threads. So, but yeah, in general, the single thread number is the metric that's used for evaluating estimating the single or the gaming performance. But that's not true in all cases, because, as I said earlier, the cache, L1, L2, L3 cache, especially L3 cache, makes a huge difference in gaming, probably more so than the single core performance in a lot of different modern games. And that's the reason why you see the X3D CPUs, like this CPU, for example, the 7950X3D or just 7800X3D. This, even though this has slightly lower single thread than this, the standard 750X or the standard non 3D, even though this one has lower single thread slightly than this one is still faster in gaming. And that's because cache makes a bigger difference than single core. So I would not really look, you don't want to look at just single core performance to judge whether or not a CPU will be good in games. You have to, it's a more holistic approach. It's not just one metric determines the overall performance estimate. So that was my old AMD CPU, and then the other one, the Intel CPU that I had was this one. There we go. There it is. The Intel Core i7 4770K. This was my swapped. Well, I didn't really swap because I kept the FX, but this was my second PC that became the main PC after a while. So this one was the Z87 chipset, and I got this. I built this on launch day, June 2nd, 2013 was when I built this one. So that was like half a year, almost a year later after the pile driver. So then I basically had these two computers for a very, very long time. It was just these two together. I skipped all of the Intel remastered editions of this, so no Broadwell. I skipped Skylake, skipped Kaby Lake. Ryzen came out, went to Ryzen immediately because this was so old. And that was it. And then now, the rest is history. We've talked about some of the other computers that I've built over the years. Newer games can use more than one core, but usually still stress one core over others. Single core was probably more the case in Kaby Lake days. We've had over a decade of 8-core consoles, but for devs. Well, the thing is, what I'll tell you guys, like if you play a game, when you're playing a game, simply open the task manager and look at how the computer is running, like while the game is active, and you will see that there's definitely more than like 2 or 3 cores that are in use while you're playing a game. Modern games can scale like way beyond like 4 cores, like way beyond 4 cores. So, and the way I've seen this, I've tested this with Threadripper, and I can see it. I can see how games behave over other, like modern games in particular, are very multi-threaded now. If I load up an older game on Threadripper, I'll see, like it'll max at like six threads, maybe 7 threads, but like 6 threads. If I open up a modern game, it's easily going more than 8 now. If it detects that there's enough threads available, if there's enough physical cores available, it'll actually leverage those. So that's why I don't really, single thread is important because your single thread performance, you basically multiply that effect to try to gauge the gaming performance. But I feel like it's more nuanced than that. I feel like if you just look at single core, that doesn't paint the whole picture. Because, like I said earlier, I take 2 CPUs. They're the same architecture. They're both Zen 4. This one has better single thread, but this one has more cache. This one clocks higher, therefore it has higher single thread. However, this one has more cache. And guess which one is faster in games? Almost all the time. This one. The X3D with the more L3 cache is the one that's faster in games. So that's why, like I said, it's more nuanced than that. So anyway, I think that's a good stopping point. I guess the last thing I was going to mention here briefly is, well, the last news article, I just had this Unreal Engine 5.4 now with improvements to nanite, AI, and machine learning. That potentially means that the TSR upscaler is going to look better. But the TSR upscaler is actually the best looking upscaler. Like, this thing is better looking than DLSS, it's better looking than FSR3, it's better looking than XESS. That's as far as I'm concerned. Like, the latest TSR for UE5 is actually the best upscaler. So, and I like how Epic does their own things. Like, they don't rely on a GPU manufacturer to develop things for them to do. They build their own engine and they add their own form of ray tracing. They add their own form of AI and machine learning. They add their own upscaler. I like that they do that. I wish more developers would do that, but obviously it's a massive, massive undertaking to develop something like this. So with that said, that's probably where I'm going to end the stream. Once again, thank you all for tuning in, all the new subscribers, the new viewers. It does help me, it does kind of motivate me to keep making this type of content, keep doing this weekly thing. As we get closer to Computex, I think we're going to start seeing more leaks, and probably more leaks pertaining to new motherboards. And that's where I think most of the tech press, the tech media is going to focus. So I hope you guys enjoy the content. As always, if you like the videos, please like the videos. It does help me. Subscribe to the channel if you really like the content. I try to answer questions live as much as possible, even after we get through all the news articles of the week. So I try to leave enough time to be able to answer any questions that come up during the stream. So with that being said, I'm going to get on out of here, and I will catch you guys. Possibly I might do a weekend live stream. I'm not 100% sure yet. I have a lot of stuff that I need to do that's unrelated to YouTube. But I will catch you guys at the very least next week, next Thursday, on the next episode of This Week in Tech. Until then, take care, and I'll see you guys next time.